April 27th, 2022 meeting of the Early Learning Council for the state of Oregon. Glad to have each of you with us today. And I'm going to ask Remy if she would please call the roll.
Yes, Angie Blackwell.
I'm present.
Katie Brooks
is coming a little late.
Excuse me, she's coming a little late. She'll be here. She's present. Peter Buckley.
Here.
Ann Kubich.
Here.
George Mendoza.
Here.
Perfect timing. Dr. Peg Miller.
Here.
Kali Thorne Ladd.
Present.
Sue Miller, Chair.
Here.
And then we have Pat Allen, the Director of the Oregon Health Authority.
Here.
Colt Gill, the Director of the Oregon Department of Education.
Here, thanks.
We have an open seat for the Oregon Housing and Community Services. Liesl Wendt, Deputy Director of the Oregon Department of Human Services.
Present.
And then finally, Alyssa Chatterjee, the Early Learning System Director at the Oregon Early Learning Division.
Here.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Remy. Okay, we're excited to start off the meeting today, as is now our pattern, with having sharing reflections on the presentations that we had at our last meeting from ODHS and the child welfare leadership. And Liesl, thanks for being here and a part of this, because I think it'll be interesting to just get some reflections from council members on what we heard from the staff at ODHS, and specifically focusing on the 0 to 5 or prenatal to 5 focus of their vision for transformation. And just as we did with the OHA presentation a month ago, trying to see where is the council's role in supporting our partner agencies in implementing what their plans and visions are for supporting families with young children in Oregon. So it's an exciting time where, as you know, we're trying to lay the groundwork for the sort of refocusing and restating our strategic plan, Raise Up Oregon, which will be the focus of our council retreat in October. So all of these discussions and questions and insights will go into what should we be proposing for the 2023 to 2028 vision for early learning in the state of Oregon. So exciting time, kind of a long timeline, but in some ways it will probably seem very short. So with that as an introduction, I'd like to, and thanks once again to Harriet Dichter at the BUILD initiative. We have a great, very short synopsis of what the child welfare staff presented at our last council meeting. And certainly they offered some suggestions of how we can work together, child welfare and the council and early learning in general. And then we've proposed some sort of discussion questions or prompts for our meeting this morning in how do we see us connecting to child welfare. And hopefully all of us council members have ways in suggestions, examples that we can offer of what's going on in our own either agencies or our own areas in the state. So with that, I'm going to just open it up for conversation and see who would like to lead off and offer some suggestions and input.
Sue, I tend to jump in first during these meetings, and so I was going to jump in first and suggest that somebody else jump in first this time. That was my suggestion, but
I think we will welcome you jumping in first again, Peter.
it looks like Ian might be ready to jump.
Oh,
Well, I will just start us at a very, very general level, because I think just to say that I think all of us, and I know for us in particular, are just so thrilled to see the positive reframe that ODHS is taking on all of these important topics and the welfare of our children in Oregon, and that there's and this understanding that there's an urgent need for our youngest kids, and it's just so it's so refreshing. It's so important, and I think we all, I know that I do in all of our work, stand ready to be as helpful as we can. And the big challenge is to go from the broad framing of it to the actual local implementation of it. And so how is it that we're going to really develop those partnerships and collaboration at the local level? I really appreciated the community context that you're sort of bringing to this, and saying that communities are different, and the community context with which you're sort of viewing child welfare and appreciating the equity part of that conversation is great. And so the question is how we can help bring that down to the local level, because that's really where where does the rubber hit the road? It's really at the local level. How do we create the local collaborations, bring in the local knowledge, develop the local capacity to really make that happen? And as you say, Sue, we do have some examples that I think can help us understand what some of those things look like. How do we lift out of those examples what we've learned? How do we take them and think about them as pilots that then can be invested in at a broader scale is really the challenge for us. And so how then, going back, how do all of us as the members of the ELC help with that? What kinds of community support is happening from the ELD to make this happen well? So that's that's the framing that I sort of bring to this conversation. Just appreciation for the themes that are there, and understanding how hard it is, that the work is about making it all happen at the local level.
right. Thank you, Anne. Really good point. And I know that the Ford Family Foundation, with that hat on, you certainly see a lot of examples down in the southern and rural parts of Oregon. So it's exciting to have those partnerships.
And Liesl knows many of them, and Liesl, thank you so much for stopping by a couple of weeks ago to have more interaction with us about it. And we will continue to share those examples and lift them up for you, and in the hopes that it's helpful.
So if I can tag on to what Anne was saying,
yeah,
I echo everything that you said. This is tremendously exciting, very, very supportive of it. I think it's a fantastic direction to move in. I do have questions about how do you change a culture? That's really a challenge. How do you change an entire culture? And I'm glad that's being focused on. But I do have, I guess, some concerns in that it sounded from the OHA presentation, the OHA was also talking about community collaborations, and I'm glad that DHS is talking about community collaborations. I just think it's going to be essential for us to make sure all the work is aligned. We're doing a lot of the collaborations around education as well. So how does the collaboration around the Oregon Health Authorities work regionally, ODHS's work regionally, ODE's work regionally? How do we make sure all of those different efforts align with each other, and we're not duplicating, trying to pull the same people to 3 different meetings instead of trying to get everybody on the same page at the same time? So that's just something I wanted to throw in there.
Yeah, Pat, would love to hear your thoughts about, obviously you are one of the players at this big table.
Yeah, just a quick reaction to Peter's comment. I agree that we really need to work to align that work. I have great fear, however, that at some point that turns into an office of initiative alignment, and we end up with some kind of an unwieldy process that bogs everything down in bureaucracy. And so trying to figure out how to do that alignment in real time and as good as you can while still authentically being engaged with community, I think is really, really important. I would love for the problem to be, you're asking us for too much engagement, please stop. That's not the problem that we're facing right now.
Well said. And here we thought you wanted to be head of that Office of Community Alignment, Pat. So
Hard pass.
yes. Yeah. And I know all of the agency directors on this call are also being asked to do this community engagement work. And we're going to hear from Alyssa later in the meeting this afternoon, in fact, about what ELD is doing around that. So
I'll chime in a little. I think Liesl mentioned in the chat that the hubs may be a good venue, and I think perhaps to try and align things, because most of those groups are represented on the hubs, and it's a good place for conversation to take place. As somebody who kind of deals with it from the child abuse perspective, I think, again, I'm very supportive of this change, and I agree. I think it's difficult to change culture, and I think it's difficult to establish trust. I think that is really going to be a key to this whole thing with regard to communities and to the families that are being served, is that establishment of trust. Certainly, less family disruption is going to lead to more resiliency in kids, and that's a key point. I see a huge need for good case management so that families that are having difficulty, that need added support, that becomes a fluid kind of process, that they're given more support when they need it and less when they're being more independent. And I think we also need to have some tools to effectively evaluate the success of that, so that we can, again, adjust this kind of as we're going forward. If we hit a snag, then we need to find a way to work around that.
Chair Miller?
Yeah, Khalid.
I agree with everything said. I had a couple thoughts about how we would prioritize for our engagement. I guess I'm wondering how, as we do raise up Oregon, are there things that can be integrated into that are aligned with the ODHS plan? And so there can be some intentionality that the council has in creating that alignment. And I think the hubs, as already has been said, they're critical players. And so how do we ensure the hubs are part of the process, that it doesn't happen by happenstance, but that there's some intentionality, so that we use the infrastructure that we've sort of helped set up over the years to support what ODHS is trying to do. And then the third thought I had was just, I wonder if there is a role in building trust. If Liesl and team have presented to the different student success plans, the culturally specific student success plans, because there you have leaders from the different communities of color that are focused on children's success. And clearly this is something that impacts children and an amount of children of color, particularly in the Indigenous and Black communities that are showing up in the system. So it feels important to have conversations at those tables, which is not something for the council to do, but I would just offer it as something to consider for the department, so that because those people, those ambassadors, so to speak, could be helpful in trust building.
And I wonder, just to follow up on Khalid's comments, whether, in thinking about these partnerships that need to happen, if it would be helpful to think about the different roles that different kinds of conveners can play. So, the hubs are certainly the place where they have maybe the most opportunity to do some of the work with a broad array of partners, which might be different from the partnerships that are really focused on those families who are most at risk. And when I think about some of the things that we're funding in Douglas County with like funding safe families as a model of working with families most at risk, and in the partnership with FARA, which I think is Faith and Family Relationship Advocates, or FAIR is that intensive therapeutic model, which is what we're doing in partnership with the Oregon Social Learning Center and with ODHS and the CCO and the local therapeutics, that there's sort of different kinds of things that are targeted for different kinds of needs in terms of intensity, most at risk versus more universal kinds of work, and so on. And that might be a helpful follow on to what Kali was saying.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Anne. And you know, as you just put out a couple of examples down in the Roseburg area, excuse me, of these convenings and sort of tables that have been set. I think one of the awarenesses to have is that there are a lot of these conversations already going on. And how do we support our agency partners in even being aware of those at a local or regional level, so that they don't feel they have to be, you know, the new person on the block or sort of the lone ranger in trying to get some of these cross-sector and conversations going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great, Sue, because getting back to the point about, to Sue's point, to Peg's point rather, about trust and relationships, is where there are relationships and where there has been trust built, even if it's not the perfect, collaboration of absolutely everybody on the table, just build from there. And so maybe what we need is sort of just a census or a review of what's out there, sort of community by community, that is really trying to pull these sectors together, and to see what's there to build on. And maybe that's a starting point. I don't know.
Yeah, is anyone aware of that kind of roadmap or census or whatever, even in your own regions or your own agencies?
I think in our case, it would certainly just be inside somebody's head, and they could sit down and they could tell you about it, but it would be nice to put those on paper.
Right. I assume that could be a beginning point.
I think a couple of things are happening through OHA. Actually, the Connect Oregon closed loop referral system is actually doing a serving to bring forward what partnerships are there and getting data behind how those partnerships are working. And then the CCO metric on social emotional learning is it's requiring the CCOs to map out what the assets are for children in regard to their region or the community's ability to enhance social emotional learning. So I think that could go hand in hand with this effort to identify which are the potential partners in the work for ODHS as well.
Yeah, great example. So I would ask the agency directors who are on this call, is this resonating with you, or do you already have kind of a census or an understanding of what's going on through your different divisions or work in the regions? So would it be easy for you to just download things like Peter's just suggesting for OHA?
It's mixed. I think we particularly have developed a new capacity as well as a new mindset through the course of the pandemic around our connectedness to community and the structures that we have to be able to do that connection. We've regionalized and fieldized, if that's a word, things like epidemiologists. We have an epidemiologist in Coos Bay because of remote work. That's a person that's not only good for recruiting, but it's a person that we have not had access to because she wants to be able to work in Coos Bay. And that kind of plays out through lots and lots and lots of things that we're doing right now. It resonates in the community engagement we've done around the 1115 waiver that we talked about a couple of meetings ago. But it's all still really very much in development and fairly, though increasingly not exclusively particularized to COVID. As we think about Healthier Together Oregon, the state health improvement plan, the engagement that went into that work, I think those muscles are getting better, but they continue to need a lot of development.
And Sue, for ODHS, and we actually had this conversation with Ann, which I really appreciated at Ford Family Foundation. You know, one of the challenges with how we're funded to do the work. We're not funded to engage community. We're not funded to do equity work. We've made some asks. We have not been successful in that effort, unfortunately. So it sort of perpetuates the siloing, right? Because I think Ann made a great point that does our district manager even know all the things that Ford's funding for the populations we're serving? Probably not, right? It's a sheer capacity issue. So that's just a how state government works sort of challenge. I think the other challenge slash, perhaps concrete deliverable that can come out of this conversation is there's a long gap between what's been funded in Salem and what a local community needs. And there's not a roadmap to get from point A to point B. So, when we were in Jackson County, as an example, talking about fire survivors, we've got some great local folks who, if but for 160,000 could do X, if but for 200,000 could do Y. I think we all know there's more money than there's probably ever been in many of our spaces, but how do we get our dollar to the person at the local community doing the work? And something that our team's going to look at is how do we look at the last two long session, short session, and put together community information about, okay, there's this funding opportunity here for these things. There's this funding opportunity there. So I think this group, that I don't know who takes that assignment, so to speak, but I think that is something on us as state leaders to figure out how to better close that gap and make the funding opportunities that are available more accessible.
Well, that's an excellent point, Liesl, especially about there's more money in the system than we've ever seen before. And obviously getting it to where it's needed and who can really deploy it. And frequently that's going to be community-based organizations. And it's what Ann's talking about, the people locally on the ground. And Peter, I think you have examples of how you're trying to make those connections down in Southern Oregon, right?
It's just what I do every day. it's my day job. So yeah, I'm trying to make those connections for people. We actually had the youth development division folks come down last week. It was great. And they came down, they met with different folks working in youth development, were able to explain what their programs were. And apparently, Lisa, as opposed to ODHS, they actually get paid to do that. They actually have staff time, set aside to spend time with the community organizations and connect, basically really around the re-engagement issue of kids who have kind of dropped away from the K-12 system. So again, the willingness is there of participants on the community level. And again, I go back to the CCOs that I know the CCOs are trying to figure out how do they engage with community-based organizations in a way that's sustainable for the community-based organizations. And that's an issue. So again, I always keep going back to, we're making sure that this is coordinated. I love the direction that ODHS is going in. Is it coordinated with the CCOs in every region? And is it coordinated with K-12 and early childhood in every region? And again, I love the suggestion that the hubs might be able to play a really good convening role with that.
Right, because I think your hub has been playing that role, right, Peter?
Yeah, but
So
yeah, our hub does convene on, they're a partner with Southern Success and everything, but they do convene on a regular basis. We have our preschool K-12 alignment summits. We just had another one on April 14th, looking at play and learn groups and summer transition programs, which is really great.
So at some point, it might be interesting to have a conversation with our agency partners, and I don't know who within your systems, about how to have you, in a positive sense, use the hubs more. how can they really be integrated in the work that you're doing in this whole community outreach arena? Because historically, that's what hubs are supposed to do, but it's also what early learning has been living in forever, because early childhood can't do anything without community engagement and family support. Yeah, Pat.
So in that context, I think the variability of the hubs is in this area is a big challenge. It's hard for us to have one strategy in Southern Oregon and for engagement and a completely different strategy in the metro area, and yet a different strategy in the Mid Valley and so on. And I'm kind of really not excited about the idea of let's us go to the hubs with a proposal for how they can be of help versus that dynamic working the other way around. And again, back to variability, I think in Southern Oregon, for sure, they could do that and have done that and do that. And other places, not so much. And I think that's something that maybe the council and the division can think about how to work on or invest in, or I'm not sure what to improve their capacity to get to kind of an across the board level of what should you be able to expect from a hub.
Yep, very good point, Pat. And Alyssa, you are intimately involved with and knowledgeable about hubs. Do you have any reaction to that, thoughts about that?
No, I think this is a great and really timely question as we're looking at the latest grant agreement with hubs and thinking about deliverables. And I think this just gets back to some of the work that was really put on pause with the pandemic as a result of the analysis of hubs versus CCR&Rs, and really seeing that there is a clear need for both. But that kind of theory of change work really got put on hold, and obviously we're hiring some key positions, but I think it's just really timely as we think about what is our expectation of hubs, what are we funding them for, are we funding the right things, what are the roles of CCR&Rs, and how can we just lift up those cross-agency bodies of coordination. And to Kali's point in the chat, how do we help other hubs do what Peter's hub is doing, and expand those relationships and those tables. And to Liesel's point, how do we hear what community needs and find ways to get them resources while we do have extra resources on the table?
I think Kali had a hand up.
Yeah, Kali.
Yeah, so this might be provocative, though that's not my intent, but I wonder if it's possible to have more cross-agency investment in the hubs. I think hubs do more than just support early childhood and have the potential to, but then to me, then there should be investment coming from other agencies, not just DELC. And so is that something that has been explored? I'm literally just an idea, but I'm wondering if it's been explored or considered at all. And I think about the CCOs as well, because the CCOs are trying to do the social determinants work and preventative work, and they are more resourced. And so how do we get, thinking differently about how we invest? Because I 100% agree that their full potential, because they don't have the capacity to, because they don't have the investment that can support it.
Yeah, I think it hasn't been. And I think for those of us who've been around longer than dirt, we're a little bit hobbled by, kind of the John Kitzhaber frame of hubs are the CCOs for early childhood, right? Which I think sets up kind of a mental notion of there are provinces and different structures for those provinces. And if you go back to way back in time, that Peter will probably remember, area transportation councils and sort of there were these provinces and there were structures set up for those provinces, but there wasn't really much of a mechanism for how to cross the barriers between those. And I think some of that, even if nobody remembers that history, still kind of lives on in the way we think about those things.
Yeah, good point, Pat. I was around back in then, I guess, as old as dirt too, but I do remember those conversations and that framing. That was definitely what hubs were intended to be. Well, that can be a conversation that we can explore with our agency partners, all of whom are on this call, which is great, really great. Other thoughts, I wanted to just offer one example, a different project that I'm involved in other than the council, where child welfare in their staffings for cases, this is in Marion County, has invited community partners to come to those staffings, realizing that that's where a lot of the resources lie that can support kids to get back to their families, but also eventually, hopefully, will be in a prevention mode, which of course is what this vision of transformation is really heading for, is that you no longer need a child welfare division because kids are staying home safely. So it's in hubs are at that table with community resources, helping support the caseworkers. And we all know they're overloaded, overburdened, and that's why the burnout rate is so high. But trying to support the caseworkers to get more community resources to wrap around these families and help them be good parents and keep their kids. So it's just another example of child welfare really being creative and looking for new ways to approach their incredibly important and incredibly difficult work. So something for, I think, all of us to look at in our own communities. So any other thoughts that people, one thing we haven't talked about is workforce. And of course, that is one of those elephants in every single room that that I am involved in these days. So I don't know if when the council has any role in trying to support efforts to develop the workforce that's needed in all of these sectors, not just early learning, but it's a big one. All right, any final comments? And Lisa, I don't know if you have any comments you want to make as we wrap this conversation up.
Well, I could talk about workforce for the rest of the day, so but we won't. I think just, I guess, two thoughts. I think one on workforce and contracting. I do think there's a larger state conversation with our partners over at DAS around if we are to ensure that contracting and procurement is accessible to small culturally specific organizations. We're not there yet as a state, so that's an action item to look at too. And interestingly, and I'll drop it in the chat, HHS just released their equity goals earlier, at least this week I found them, and they had one that was very specifically around procurement. So I think that's another elephant in the room that we need to tackle collectively. So I'll put that on the table. And then workforce, right, is an issue for state staff. It is also an issue for community-based organizations. And so as we look at legislative agendas, hopefully that's an area that we can collaborate on and help tell a unified story to our legislative partners. It's not just a wage issue, right? But it's a recruitment incentive bonus. We're competing against each other of who can, have the biggest incentive bonus right now. And if you were smart, you could probably bop around and take advantage of that. So I think more collaboration there is necessary. And then I think just the last point I'd say is if the child welfare vision is successful, it's not child welfare who is engaging with the families, right? It is this collective network. And so we say that, and yet, as soon as you say child welfare, and I think, I'm looking at Peg, there's a different image that comes into your mind than if you say family stability and setting kids up for success in Oregon. And so I think we also need to start to shift of who is engaging with the family and how do we talk about that collectively.
Yeah, thanks, Liesl. Excellent points. And we're excited to partner with you in all of that. Okay, thanks all council members for that discussion. I think it was very helpful and lots of different pieces that we can follow up on at a later meeting and certainly take into our retreat as well in October. And while we have the agency directors on the line, just so you know that the October retreat dates have been set, and it's going to be Monday and Tuesday, the 9th and 10th, correct, Remy? Wherever Remy is.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll all get those on our calendars.
So
All right.
Just
Yes.
want to note George's summary in the chat. George spent his time doing a summary of the discussion, which I think is great. I just want to acknowledge and appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'm not tracking the chat. Wow. Thanks, George. Remy, be sure to send George's summary out to all of us, okay? Appreciate that. I didn't have to be taking notes after all. All right. Thanks, everybody. Let's move on then to the focus on our partner with the Department of Education. And Colt, we're delighted to have you and your staff with us today. And I think we call it a deep dive. And really looking at the many, many ways in which you and your staff and your programs intersect with families with young children. So you all obviously know that kids don't just start at age 5. And we appreciate that awareness. Believe me, we don't take it for granted at all.
There may be times when we believe that, but that's great. I love that.
So welcome, Colt. You're a wonderful partner, and we really appreciate you and your staff being here with us today. And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. We're very excited to be here today. I'll bring up some slides. The sort of list of opportunities and intersections with early learning became really long really quickly, and we took some time to narrow it down, but frankly, it's still a pretty long list of items to share with you all. So we will try to be as efficient as possible, but I brought a team with us, and we're going to try to cover 4 main topic areas. So I will talk a little bit at the beginning here about some of the one-time federal COVID-19 funds that we have that carry intersection over to the world of early learning and families. And then I will turn it over to Dan Farley, who's a Director of Assessment in our Office of Teaching, Learning, and Assessment, to talk a little bit about this transition we've been in from the kindergarten assessment and how we're hoping to work together with the council to continue to improve that and pilot new models and restart something that's really effective for the early learning systems in Oregon. And then we'll give a quick update on early intervention and early childhood special education from our Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Enhancing Student Opportunities. And then we'll get into the student success plans. So these are affinity-based groups where community from across the state of Oregon gather to help us define strengths in communities and needs to meet for students and families and staff in some cases for specific groups of students. So April Campbell, who's our Director of the Office of Indian Education, will start that off, and then she'll pass it to the Assistant Superintendent of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiatives, Deb Lang. And each of these folks may bring some other staff in for specific parts and speak to specific pieces. So Sue, I'll leave it to you on whether you want us to pause between each of these 4 sections for questions, wait till the end of the entire presentation. So you just call out when you want us to time out and answer something. Is that okay?
Yeah, excuse me, that's great, Colt. I think it will be helpful if we can do at least a short Q&A after each section,
Okay.
Because each of them kind of stands on its own.
They do.
And also, I think after you do sort of this overview of some of your investment ideas, if we could have a little bit of time to talk with you about that would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I will jump in, and again, thanks to the team for being here and presenting in their areas. I'm going to focus on the American Rescue Plan Act, so ARPA, as we typically refer to it, and a section of it that's called the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. ESSER. And it's ESSER 3 because there were a couple of previous ESSER investments in previous federal acts. The spending in those is mostly gone down. And so we're very much focused on this set of funds that must be expended by schools and the state by September 30th of 2024. So it's got a little bit longer runway for folks to be able to make their investment. This is the entire budget for the program. Almost all of the funds go directly to school districts, and school districts have a few rules around how they spend these funds, particularly that about 20% of the funds need to be spent towards unfinished learning, or what the federal government calls learning loss. So about $1 billion of the $1.1 billion goes directly to school districts, and they have a lot of authority. They are asked to engage in community engagement. We have provided them tools to go about that and asked for them to closely align to their student investment account and high school success and a couple of other funds, and given them tools to do that as well. So the part that I will focus on most is some state set-asides where we're guided in how we must invest across unfinished learning, summer learning, after-school learning, and a section that's unallocated. That adds up to a little bit over $100 million. For our plan, and before we turned it in, we went into community engagement across a series of meetings. Some happened prior to the time that we knew how much funding we would get. And then we circled back when we learned more with community, did a little bit of deeper engagement, and then we finalized with one more round of engagement. So we engaged with a few hundred people over that time from very diverse communities across the state of Oregon. That included people in the education sector, but also people in communities representing our students and families. So we start with our equity stance at the Department of Education, which is our commitment to drive our policy, our spending, our allocation, our commitment to education rigor towards anti-racist and equitable policies that are aimed at opportunities for historically and currently marginalized youth, students, and families. And recognize that sometimes to do that, we have to tear down what exists and recreate something that's new and meets the needs of the communities we're serving today. In the early engagement, our communities gave us 3 priorities for funding that came from the federal government. This was, again, before we knew exactly what the funding level would be, but knowing that some of these bills were coming our way. They asked us also to focus in on unfinished learning that was responsive, grounded in equity, and meeting students and families where they're at currently and building on their strengths while addressing their needs. And then second, to focus on health, safety, wellness, and connection in those efforts with communities. And then third, on strengthening high quality, culturally sustaining instruction, leadership, and programming. When we circled back after we had more information about how much funds we would have, how much would go directly to school districts, and how much the state could plan for directly, they sort of unpacked that and gave us 5 themes that run across the investments that we put forward. So they focus on family engagement, centering equity, recognizing the disparities of the impacts of COVID-19 and the state's response to COVID-19 on specific communities in Oregon. And then to focus on all the transition points. So from early learning into the K-12 system, between levels of the K-12 system, the sort of traditional ones would be elementary to middle school to high school. And then from leaving the K-12 system and going into career, military, higher education, and then sustainability. So a big question that runs across all of these funds, they're all one-time funds. So how do we either create things that can continue without further resource or investment, or make a tremendous difference in the now? or create something that is so compelling that we believe that the legislature would want to continue to fund after September of 2024. So with all that, we have 12 key investments for this $100 million. So it is spread out. There are several of them that cross over and have early learning connections of some kind. So the first one is about teaching and learning and developing a program that allows educators from across Oregon, K-12 educators primarily, but opportunity for others in partnership with the Educator Advancement Council, but for them to access professional learning that's developed from the Department of Ed, and then open the system up so that other providers of professional learning could access it as well. This one still has a lot of shaping to go. We know some of the content that we want to deliver focuses on early literacy and numeracy in the first phase, and then expands after that to more intermediate and upper level grades. But again, this one has to be in lockstep partnership with the Educator Advancement Council, as it is around professional learning. So this one is still going through steps of alignment. The second area, or for us, key investment number 4, is really developing our multilingual and migrant education programs. Oregon is home to the 3rd largest migrant education program in the country, but we have about the smallest level of state-supported staffing and capacity for that system. So it is very regionalized and frankly not well coordinated across the state of Oregon from our standpoint right now. So we want to continue to work on that and develop an office that can support the multilingual education, which is one of our State Board of Education goals, and migrant education. Key investment number 5 is support for the Office of Indian Education and directly to the 9 tribes who want to use funds to create healing ceremonies and other supports around the impacts of COVID-19 at the tribes. This will end up being very much cross-sector, inclusive of early learning and other sectors once the tribes get these funds and create these activities and supports for the communities. Number 7 on here, and then I'll show one more slide and we can make that pause then, Sue. Our 7th investment, 4th one crossing over into early learning, is on K-5 literacy. This does really 2 things. So it redesigns Oregon's literacy framework, which was last updated in 2009. With that, we can tie that in closely to the early learning and kindergarten guidelines that have been created, make sure that we're transitioning well from that, look at some of the new work that's been done around the science of reading, and build that into Oregon's literacy framework. And then develop companion modules and a literacy website, and provide learning series for K-12 educators that could cross over again into early learning if that was helpful. The final 3 that have strong connections, one is work that we're doing in mental health investment. This is in partnership with the Oregon Health Authority. This focuses on community care coordinators, a pilot project that would serve an urban, a rural, and a even less populated area, to help with developing community and connecting community mental health resources and school mental health resources that are multicultural, multilingual, and support students in school, their families, and the staff that work with families. It also includes support for micro-credentialing programs that can credential these community care coordinators or family support specialists, and make sure that there's room for learning and child development mental health consultation and the integrated health model, mental health model that we have developed in partnership with OHA. And then increasing mental health literacy programs for school staff, for school leaders, and then for families and students. There is an $11 million investment in providing access to funds for school districts that implement pre-kindergarten programs, not full-on multi-year pre-kindergarten programs, but the ones that happen just before the beginning of the kindergarten year. So summer programs and into the fall of the first year of kindergarten. These are family-based programs that support students for kind of school readiness activities. Many of you are familiar with Kids in Transition to School program through the Oregon Social Learning Center. So programs like that districts can apply for. And then another $10.5 million invested in early intervention, early childhood special education. And with that, before we pass it off to Dan Farley, I can take time to engage in questions, Sue.
Okay, thank you, Colt. Thanks very much. Wow, what exciting investments are coming down the line. Questions or comments from any council members about what Colt has presented?
Yes, Sue,
Yeah.
I'm jumping
Yes.
again, sorry. But
Yeah.
Colt, how is the, what's the process for applying for funds? Particularly, I'm curious about the mental health investment that you're talking about, the scalable mental health funding. Does that have to come through the district decision-making process, or what's the process?
I'm going to have to go back on that one specifically. So one thing I'll share about all of these programs is that they are just beginning to get off the ground. And like many others have noted, the challenges with workforce, the challenges with procurement have slowed these processes down from getting out the door significantly. Most of these projects are available to in a non-competitive fashion, but some of them are tied to the conditions in a community or are available, for example, to schools who participate in Title I, that kind of thing. Other of the programs have already pre-named partners, and other ones are, again, as long as you meet the criteria, you can participate. So I will go back and find out specifically about the mental health one and figure out which parts of it are available and when we believe that will go out. But I don't have that information for you today. Sorry, Peter.
That's okay. Thanks, Colt.
Thank you, Colt. Yeah, Kali, and then George.
Yes, I have a couple questions and a comment. My questions are about, you said in the beginning, Colt, you talked about schools engaging community partners. And I've asked this question probably before earlier in the year, but I'm wondering, I know that you've given them tools, which is great to support community engagement, but I'm wondering what the accountability mechanisms are that are ensuring that districts are reaching different communities, and if there's any accountability to ensuring the dollars are hitting kids that are most impacted by all the different things there have been in society over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
So that's my
great.
questions.
Okay.
Well, those are my questions.
Yeah, great question. So again, we're trying to tie things together with other investments that the state has made, so that partly so that districts don't see these as all one-off investments, but are trying to weave and combine and braid funds and work with community on where all of these investments can be most impactful. So there are different levels of accountability for different parts of the expenditure. For these federal funds in particular, there is a reporting mechanism to our ESSER office at the Department of Education that has just been built up. So as they applied for it, they needed to provide an assurance that they use their community engagement from their SIA, or from their student, I'll try not to talk in acronyms, from their student investment account effort and their high school success efforts to inform, or whether they went out with new engagement. So there is reporting there. Right now, our Office of Education Improvement and Innovation is out in the field having meetings with districts across the state of Oregon to provide direction on an integrated model of applying for all funds in the future. That has a much more robust accountability model now for showing actual artifacts of engagement, which is what we did with the original student investment account as well. So they had to be able to not only say where and when their engagements happened, but provide some evidence of that engagement and how it impacted their final decisions. And George on this committee has gone through that with the SIA previously and would have some experience being able to name what that looks like.
So, and one last thing kind of tied to it. That's super helpful. So thank you. It's good to hear. And it's good to hear that you're ramping up sort of that accountability piece. Are you tracking how many of the dollars are being used for the early years versus the high school years of the continuum? Do we have a sense of how districts are investing and if they're investing, particularly in like kindergarten, first grade, second grade years?
Yeah, I need to go back again to find out how specific that is. We know the program areas that they're investing in, and in the budget codes that are typically used for other funds that the department makes available, there are grade level codes as well. But I need to go back, Kali, and make sure that I know that that's the case for these federal funds. So I now have 2 homework assignments. I will make sure
Just
that
what you were
writing these down so I don't forget.
Just what you were hoping for,
No,
Colt.
that's good. It's all good.
It is good. Good questions, Kelly. Thank you. George, speaking of school districts.
Hey, everyone.
Hi.
And actually, for Kali, a little bit on like it'll probably vary school by school or district by district on what they do for Running Start or Jump Starts or anything that's summer school or interventions or camps or clubs. At least in LeGrand, we're going to do about 80 different camps, and then we're going to also have a Jump Start program. So we're doing a lot of enrichment because kids and families usually like enrichment in the summer, and then towards August is when we start to do a 2-week Running Start, Jump Start type program for us. But I think also some schools I'll just say some folks are tired and they don't want to necessarily work very much in the summer. There's a little bit of staff fatigue, or I'll just call it, whether it's staff fatigue or initiative fatigue or trauma that they're going through in dealing with the pandemic. There's definitely people that are tired. And some districts I think are doing a lot and some are doing a little bit less. Colt, I think for me, what I was getting out of the presentation is, as always, I'm just thankful for you and how you do things and how hard you work. The summer learning part of it, or after school learning, I am really, 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 really hopeful that we can have funds for quite some time for anything that has to do with unfinished learning over time. I think kids need more time, more practice, more opportunities, definitely after school and even in summer for quite some time. Anything that we can do for interventions or enrichment during the school year and after the school year is, to me, something in the next 5 to 10 years that schools will need. So my hope is that that's something that our representatives and senators and legislature really thinks about. Another one too is just, you have mental health in there, and it's a nice amount, but it's in perpetuity. The mental health programs, the behavioral programs. Right now, I'm going to just say our kindergarten, first grade, second grade teachers, when they get a chance to talk to me about behavior and kids and their regulation and how they're handling change or how they're handling anything in their school day for, hey, I need you to stop doing that thing. And they cry, they get upset. There's not that much underneath. It doesn't take that much to trigger a child. It doesn't take that much to trigger a teacher now. It doesn't take that much to trigger a parent. So somewhere in all of these behavior things, we've got to get a lot of money in there, whether it's counseling or whether it's wraparound or whether it's, I'll just call it programs and services and specially designed instruction or placement or location or staffing to support with success rooms or staffing to support with counseling or therapeutic services. In general, we've got to do something that's long-term supporting behavior and mental health. And I'll just say, the folks that complain to me the most are I'll just say my first grade teachers, but number 2 is my second grade teachers. And middle school folks are just complaining all the time about how kids are behaving nowadays. And I'll just say the fatigue of staff in dealing with behaviors, and that it could be cell phones, it could be talking back, it could be disrespect, it could be all these things. So I'm just giving you there's a lot of behavior and mental health things going on, and we're going to need funding, or we're going to need services, we're going to need collaboration with other agencies to make this better. There's my pitch for future investments or long-term investments.
Thanks, George. I appreciate it. My son is a middle school teacher, so I'm hearing that one.
I'll bet you are.
Yeah, my daughter's a 6th grader.
Yeah, I have a 7th grade daughter, so I hear it as well.
You all are living in that world. Well, and the whole suspension, expulsion, prevention plan that's coming down obviously needs to be, and I'm sure is being integrated in some of this work too. And we'll probably hear more about that from Alyssa this afternoon. Okay, shall we move on? Because, oh yes, Angie, sorry.
Thank you, Chair Miller. Cool. I would like to hear a little bit more about the additional investment in early intervention, early childhood special education. And I'm just wondering what this looks like at the local level. I've been very hopeful after the first, infusion. I know that there was additional investment a couple of years back. And I know that probably the pandemic has interrupted some of the implementation of the plans. But I'm just wondering, what has that resulted in so far? And what can we look for with this initial investment? I know each region has their own way of providing services. I work in Polk County, so I work with the Willamette ESD, which I understand offers services a little differently than other regions. But I'm not really seeing what I was hoping, which was, maybe additional support and capacity for direct services. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, actually what I'll do is I'll invite Tennille Weatherall to chime in on that. And I will say across the state, again, one of the things we're seeing, even though there's increased investment, is there's not an increased workforce out there. So it's been really challenging to get the people in those positions. But Tennille, is there anything you want to say to that?
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much. And I'm going to invite Kara to share more, but we have been working towards really utilizing these funds in important ways to elevate some of the things that you've been naming. Kara?
Thank you, Tennille. So my name is Kara Williams. I'm the Director of Early Intervention and Early Childhood Special Education at the Department of Education. And I think that, Angie, you're talking about the Student Success Act funds or the Early Learning Account funds. And we actually, Colt and Tennille are both right that COVID certainly did, was our first year of having those funds. We also had COVID. And so rolling that out and getting those services in place has been certainly a challenge. But those funds are specifically directed towards increasing inclusion, increasing what we call adequate service levels. So assuring that each child is getting at least a standard adequate level of service and improving child outcomes. We're on our second year of implementation of those SSA funds. And a lot of programs have directed that into staff recruitment and retention, which is also a huge issue right now. And so we do see that the adequate service levels are improving. We are monitoring the data to see what else is needed in order for us to support those goals of inclusion, high quality inclusion, those goals of improving child outcomes. And I think that you're exactly right, Angie, that some of that does come with additional staffing and direct services, and trying to figure out how to best do that in this very challenging climate of with staff recruitment and retention.
Okay.
Thank you for addressing that.
Yeah, thanks. And good questions, Angie. I know that's been a real challenge in your world. We talked about that. All right. Thank you all. We're going, if I don't see any other hands raised from council, let's move on then. Colt, if you want to introduce Dan.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sue. And Dan Farley, who's our Director of Assessment, will talk a little bit again about the transition and what's been known as the kindergarten assessment, and before that, the kindergarten readiness assessment. So it's going through more transition. He'll talk us through that. What I will say, Dan and the rest of our team, we are a little bit behind time, and I want to make sure we have room for the Student Success Advisory Group information. So if anything you can do to move through your slides more quickly will be helpful.
Okay. All right.
Welcome,
thanks,
Dan.
Thanks, Sue. And thanks, Colt, for the introduction. I am going to be providing current information on ODE and ELD's, soon to be DELC's, joint effort to redesign Oregon's kindergarten assessment process. I'll invite Alyssa, Colt, David to jump in any opportunity that they see being relevant. I may also need to call for reinforcements from our K2 balanced assessment specialist, Sodie Fern, who has been leading a lot of the discussions from the assessment team side during this process. So there are quotes around the term kindergarten assessment here. As Colt mentioned, it's an assessment that's in transition. It's also an assessment that is situated in a transition, from early learning program to K-12. And we are trying to redesign the entire approach to meet historical concerns that were present with the prior iteration of the KA, which is what I will probably call the kindergarten assessment from here on. So along with this redesign, a new name will develop, and until we have a new name and a new specificity around that, we're going to just use quotation marks. The new course of action will leverage what we know about early learning and also tend to the needs of Oregon's early learners. We're also hoping to design a system that can provide information and practices that kindergarten teachers and families also stand to benefit from. I want to emphasize before I get into too many of the details that we're at the very early stages of what will be an intentional, multi-phase and longitudinal process. We're fully committed to anti-racist assessment practices and know that we need to center a community voice in our development efforts in order to fully deliver on meeting the purpose of the redesigned KA, which is to broadly inform how our state serves early learners. We're also making substantial efforts to ensure that indirect benefits are also experienced by kindergarten teachers, as I mentioned, who will be doing a lot of the work of helping families and students navigate this new set of assessment approaches. I'm going to walk us through a few of the concerns that were present in our prior iteration of the KA to help us all remain accountable for ensuring that we do not duplicate the same errors that were present either in terms of design or implementation. So you can see those challenges for the prior KA here. At its heart, the kindergarten assessment suffered from a lack of clarity about purpose. It suffered from having a singular purpose as well. It's very difficult to design an assessment that can meet multiple purposes. You'll notice, and Colt pointed out, we've removed the term readiness from our efforts because readiness was situated inappropriately within students. And it really is whether or not the school is ready. So the question is, are our systems at risk of not being able to serve our students? The students are coming and they are learning. We also heard from district partners that the information collected was redundant with existing universal screening and progress monitoring systems. We heard from kindergarten teachers that they didn't see any added value in the data or the process that was implemented. That in combination with concerns about the approaches to learning components, which were observational, which also were not developed with students who reflect Oregon's full diversity, nor should I add, were any trainings on implicit bias that can be a part of any observational component provided during that training and during that process of recording those data. In addition to that, the approaches to learning, because it had obviously some behavioral components, conveyed what I would call dominant cultural norms. And I like to put norms in quotes because the word itself is also centered in dominant culture. So we are trying to envision a new approach that engages community, looks at the whole child, and to do that work well, we need your support, guidance, questions to help us ensure that we live into this set of values moving forward. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we are at the earliest phase of this work. The final inventory project will be framed such that it does incorporate anti-racist practices, substantially includes community voice, and then guides our early learning and care sector, as I already shared. We revised the purpose of the assessment based on advisory panel input. So we have constituted a quote unquote KA advisory panel that is reflective of Oregon's diversity. You'll also notice that our own evolving understanding of the goal and purpose is kind of reflected in where we are now. We're in learning systems, and we are not excluding research. We're not excluding perspective. We are trying to stay in a listening stance and a stance of curiosity as we go through this. The scope of influence for the project has been defined as covering the early learning and care sector. We thus anticipate that the data that will be used in combination with data from other sectors can tell us about the early learning system as a whole. We also know that local, regional, and state level agencies don't know for sure what other experiences families are accessing, so beyond state-sponsored programs, and how can an agency influence and support all Oregon's early learners. This approach should help address that question. It's also the reason why we have a statewide administration in mind. Next slide, please. So there are 5 primary areas of work. I have a really great graphic that is in shape of buckets, but these are boxes. So you'll have to deal with 5 boxes that are masquerading as buckets. To date, we have leaned into the development of a single initial component, which is a family interview that will both inform the early learning sector and support kindergarten teachers in developing relationships with families. And we are still very close to the starting line in that work. We're going to be hosting listening sessions in the coming weeks with a diverse group of families to gather initial feedback on the questions that we plan to address. And of course, those questions will be refined through an iterative process as well. If you're curious about the families who will be engaged in this first set of listening sessions, we have 2 families from different tribes that are in Oregon. There are 2 families that identify as Black African American, 2 families that indicated that their children experienced disability or trauma. And we are in the process of confirming with 2 more families who identify as Latino, Latina, Latinx. And there are 3 families that are still part of the initial reach out. We are trying to incorporate a Russian-speaking family. There's also a great language diversity already present in the families who are engaged as well. So we're really trying to design the approach at the beginning so that it meets the needs of families that have been marginalized by prior practices. And we know that if we design it that way, it will be accessible to all families thereafter. We're also committed to planning ongoing engagements with communities this coming year, specifically communities of color and families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We'll continue to collect feedback from our kindergarten assessment advisory panel. We have a district test coordinator expert panel who are DTCs, I call them. That's our primary audience on the assessment team, who are also advising us in terms of the district impact questions that are present. We have an assessment advisory committee that also is reviewing our plan, and a national technical advisory committee as well. So we have multiple ways that we can get feedback, both technical and adaptive, across our entire system about the redesigned process, including national and local experts. The test development process will include connecting with families on a small scale during listening sessions. As I mentioned, we also have a small pilot planned for the fall of 2022. And again, all of that work will be captured. We'll learn from it. We'll design better questions going forward that are more inclusive and more accessible over time. Next slide, please. So this is an updated and estimated timeline. We have had to shift timelines to some degree as we are also interacting with systems that are tired and behind schedule. So our current plan is to conduct a small intentional pilot with a group of district schools and possibly even classrooms. We have the ability to go to a very small scale in terms of the sample this coming fall. We can share the results and outcomes of that process with this group, of course, and also as we go through the work. We are hoping to look forward and incorporate any additional components, what I would call in test speak, constructs or areas that we want to incorporate into a redesigned kindergarten assessment process over the coming year and beyond. But part of the multi-phase language that I used includes the kind of leaning into the question of like, what other information do our communities need? What information does our early learning systems need to better serve students across the state prior to entering kindergarten? And then how can we also leverage those processes as much as possible and also not influence assessment redundancy in the kindergarten space as well? So that's kind of our general frame. Next slide, please. Next steps are the one that you'll probably fix on, and the one I'm fixed on is presenting to the State Board and the Early Learning Council again in May. So again, there will be some development. We are hoping to have at least a couple of the family listening sessions conducted by then and can give updated information about what we're learning there. And with that, I will pause and ask Sue to coordinate any questions, recommendations, or concerns that are present.
Okay, thank you, Dan, for a very great overview and as well as details about where the KA is going. Are there questions from council members? Kali?
This is mostly a comment. I am just so excited about where you're going. So I just want to thank you. This is, I think, the absolute right direction. And it is just really, I don't know, affirming and helpful to hear that truly you have heard some of the concerns. I know that many of us in the field have heard them as well over the years. And your presentation, I think, just illuminates that not only that you've heard, but that you're pivoting based on what you've heard and choosing a direction that I think is more sound from a research standpoint and an evaluation standpoint that will reduce variance based on bias and other things that existed in the past and will allow us to make more valid inferences from the assessment. The only thing that I would say is I know that we do see some challenges with literacy in particular in the early years. We're seeing it before children enter kindergarten. So ensuring there are ways to capture that and support children, not in a way that is punitive, but that can just support their growth in literacy skills. So anyway, thank you for your work.
Thanks, Kali.
Yeah, great comments, Kali. Peter.
Just, yeah, real quick, I echo what Kali said, but also I just want to make sure that there's at least some conversation happening between the CCOs as they do their work to determine the social emotional metrics for children up to the age of 5. I hope conversations are happening, Dan, with your group and with OHA folks who are focused on the social emotional metrics. But I think you can inform OHA and OHA can help inform you so that we're aligned as much as possible.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, great point, Peter. That alignment that we've been sort of talking about all morning through this discussion. Any other comments, feedback for Dan or questions?
I have.
Yeah, George.
And I know I walked out for a second, so I might have missed part of it. Dan, as it relates to carrying it out and the logistics for implementation. Mm-hmm. Is this something where you were thinking, or the ODE is thinking that it happens early in the school year, first month of school. Teachers, take 2, 3, 4 days to have 30-minute, 45-minute interview sessions with families and collect the data? Or is it, how are we structuring the amount of time for schools to do this? That's one thing that I thought about, that I'll just say the implementation of it, if it takes a lot of time, energy, resources, that's something we got to understand.
Yeah.
And potentially have substitutes or get. The other part too is relationships right now. Engagement with family, connection with family is harder, not easier. Folks are not as we're not communicating as well, or we're not getting that level of involvement. So some level of that, I'll just call it that professional development, or that thought process for re-engaging relationships. I think education is kind of in a low trust time right now, and folks aren't necessarily wanting to communicate very well. So I think some, thoughts around that are the thoughts that I've been processing while you've been presenting, that I'll just say trust is low. So relationships need to be built, and that I love the idea of great communication and engagement with one another, but the amount of time for staff to do this work is something that school districts will have to figure out too.
Thanks, George. I can talk about, I think there were 3 or 4 different points you made. I'll try to address them all. And then invite anyone else who wants to jump in to do so. So we're very much concerned about the impact of whatever system we develop on available resources. So we're really talking about a very narrow set of questions, like in the 6 to 8 questions range, maybe even tighter if we can get that. So a process that would take 15 minutes per child, that may also include some protocols for campus tours, meeting the office administrator, those kinds of things. So yeah, we looked at the landscape. We did some basic math. How many students are in an average kindergarten classroom? How much time do teachers have during the planning week that isn't already committed to professional learning opportunities? And there wasn't a whole lot of landscape left. So we know that we need to be super efficient and have a very small number of items. So it is in that range.
I would say just 1 day or 2 days, it sounds like, based on what you just said, and maybe schools have to have a substitute for 1 day or 2 days to get it, go through this. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's quite all right. And then those kinds of questions too is what we haven't figured out everything right about how it's going to work. That's one of the reasons we need to go through like a piloting process, and we'll learn from you. There are other ways of thinking through like when it happens and how it should be supported. The interview component, in order to like leverage its full purpose, has to be administered toward the beginning of the year. It should be possibly one of the first experiences. Unlike our prior assessment efforts, this one is really like appropriately situated right there. Yes, is in terms of the timing, and that's kind of the breadth conversation. And I know that we have more to figure out, because there are also impacts potentially with existing, union contracts and scheduling, et cetera. So we'll have to work through those kinds of details with getting feedback from district partners.
Okay, thank you, Dan and George. Thanks for those questions and comments. You are on the ground, so you know what this is translating into. Okay, let's move on. Dan, thank you very, very much for a very informative presentation, and we're excited to see you again in May.
All right, thanks, Sue.
So thank you. And Colt, I just want to make sure you know that we actually have until noon for your presentations. So just so you don't feel hopefully too constricted. And I love this slide that's up right now, by the way. That's one of my favorites in the whole deck.
Nice, good. Okay, so I will turn it over to Neil and Kara. We'd want not to go over 10 minutes for this section with questions, so we get the full 20 for the student success groups.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. And Kara and I want to be really brief in our update, as we often have the opportunity to have Colt share or share ourselves. with you. And we really want to make space for the student success plans because the information is amazing and it's super exciting. We can't wait for you to hear more about that. I do want to share before passing it over to Kara how critical the success of early learning partnerships are for our early childhood special education program and how focused and sincerely committed we are to improving the outcomes for all families and children by working collectively with our early learning partners across the state. I'm going to turn it over to Kara just so that we can be as brief as possible and have time for questions. Kara.
Thank you, Tennille, and thank you, Sue. I'm glad that you liked that slide. I was trying to just kind of popcorn out all of the partners that we depend on to assure that infants and toddlers are served in their natural environments and that young children and preschoolers are served in the least restrictive environments along with their peers. So those are all the folks that we count on to do that important work. With input from the Department of Education and also from the Division of Early Learning and Care and multiple other stakeholders, we worked with Education Northwest to develop and conduct a community engagement process to really explore how children and families are accessing and experiencing early intervention and early childhood special education services. And we wanted to hear from communities and from families, what are some of the successful practices that are happening in their communities, and also what some of the system improvements need to happen in order to assure that services are happening more successfully. The resulting engagement report that was released in January of 2022, and I'm just going to put a link to it in the chat here, really details the collaborative recommendations of both the Department of Education and the Division of Early Learning on how we're going to move forward after hearing those recommendations. So the recommendations are regarding improvement of the family experience with EIECSE, regarding equitable access, inclusive placement in neighborhood programs, and transition to kindergarten. Improvement to the administration of EIECSE programs and communities, including addressing the workforce issues that we mentioned earlier, funding, collection and usage of adequate service level data, and coordination across our early learning system. And lastly, recommendations regarding the support of future community engagement with culturally and linguistically diverse families. So as a next step in this report, we are going to be working very closely with the Division of Early Learning and Care and the Department of Education, working with the statewide leadership team on high quality inclusion and the State Interagency Coordinating Council to take a really close look at these recommendations and do some planning for next steps. Next slide, please. And because it seems to be report season for us, we had another report that was released regarding our efforts towards high quality early childhood inclusion. So knowing that EIECSE serves about 11% of the total populations of infants, toddlers, and children from birth to 5, it's really important for us to know and understand where these students are served, and that they're served again in those natural environments or least restrictive environments. So in 2020, the Department of Education actually received a technical assistance award from the National Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center to implement high quality inclusive preschool policies and practices at all levels of early learning and care. So again, in close collaboration with the Division of Early Learning and Care and other state and local partners, we put together a statewide leadership team to define the actions that we need to take in order to ensure that there's equitable access to early care, education, and services. Additionally, we have 3 communities in Oregon right now that are embarking on the road to implementation of these high quality inclusion indicators. Each community has assembled a community inclusion team, and each community participates in intensive professional development and coaching. And on March 31st of 2022, the Department of Education and the Division of Early Learning and Care and early learning system leaders and advocates from around the state released our first Oregon Early Childhood Inclusion Indicators Initiative annual report, which really details our progress towards creating equal opportunity to access high quality early care and education for children experiencing disability. The report also reiterates our need for continued investment to ensure that families and providers and general and special education staff have the support that they need to provide stable and continuous care for young children in the community and in early care and education environments. What you are seeing on this slide is just a representation of the progress that we've made towards implementation of the state indicators of high quality inclusion, which include indicators regarding leadership, family engagement, funding, standards, coordination of professional development, and personnel preparation. And we really look forward to continuing our work with our cross-agency partners. And again, I will post the link to this report in the chat. Lastly, due to all of this work happening in early learning and inclusion and early intervention and early childhood special education, we wanted to address the question that actually came up earlier, which is around what investments are we making towards this effort? So there are two very substantial investments that we're making. One is through the Student Success Act Early Learning Account, which we talked about previously. There's $37.5 million annually going to ECSE programs to increase adequate service levels, to improve child outcomes, and to increase access to the least restrictive environment or to implement high quality inclusion. Additionally, we have also directed some of the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds to a few different shared projects. One of those is $200,000, which is going to fund the criminal background records check that ECSE providers have to go through in order to provide services in preschools and childcares. This will make the process much quicker and allow folks to get through the process quicker and into those classrooms quicker. So we're really hoping that this will help to contribute to some of those recruitment and retention issues that we've been experiencing. We're investing $4 million in coaching and professional development. We're actually doing this alongside the Division of Early Learning and Care's ELSI coaching program. So we didn't want to create a separate system, a separate siloed system. So we are just adding some funding to the existing ELSI program in order to create professional development and coaching specific to those high quality inclusion indicators for childcare providers and preschool teachers. And then an additional $6.3 million are going to go to ECSE programs straight to them in order to accommodate some of the loss that may have occurred due to COVID-19 and some more longstanding issues, which tend to be recruitment and retention, which we continue to talk about. So lots of programs are looking at forging partnerships with higher education institutions and also with going out of state to do recruitment efforts out of state.
Wow. Thank you, Kara, for once again, great overview, great information. Questions from council members or reactions, thoughts? A quick question I have, I'm wondering, where are the 3 demonstration sites, Kara, that you mentioned?
So we have one in Multnomah County, we have one in Clackamas County, and we have one in Lincoln County.
Lincoln. Okay, thanks.
And we're also looking at expanding next year. So we'll be reviewing applications and looking at adding more communities next year.
Great. Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear a report from how those communities are doing, what they're doing with the funds. Kali.
I'm wondering, so sort of putting on my former hat, this is a big issue with Black families. There's a lot of fear and concern about early intervention, and we often talked about how can we educate families. And I think I would imagine there are other Black culturally specific orgs that think about how do you educate families about this so they know and understand the enrollment process. Are you looking at investing in culturally specific orgs and then to do this work, as well as bringing in, we also saw that when we could bring people into our space, there was more trust. We could not get, it was very hard to get families to go to somewhere and then talk about the mental health of their child. And there are so many children that were coming in kindergarten that clearly had issues. And the fear and the stigma prevented early diagnosis, which really made very difficult learning experience for the child and family. So I'm just wondering, I wanted you maybe to go a little deeper in how you're going to partner with culturally specific communities. What will the investments look like? If there are investments, what will the training look like? Because it's a huge need. I can only speak within the African-American, huge need. And I have not talked to anyone doing early ed work with Black families that don't see this as a need. But there's also just big barriers when it comes to people feeling comfortable because of the history of racism. People are not comfortable with this. And it is, I believe, impeding children from thriving.
Absolutely, Callie. Thank you. That came out very strongly in the community engagement report. We realized that we have a lot of work to do in assuring that we're engaging properly. We also have really been doing some deep dive work with our EIECSE intake coordinators, and those are really the first people that families have contact with when their child has been referred for special education services. And we're really uncovering a real need for professional development and coaching for those folks to be able to reach out and follow through with families in a way that feels safe. As you said, Callie, with our African-American Black students. And also we've had a lot of connection with child welfare, who has said that parents are afraid and not sure who's trying to contact them and not sure who, what system early intervention and early childhood education, special education are connected to. And so, a lot of our work right now is going in with those intake coordinators. We have a community of practice that we've set up. And yes, we are absolutely looking at making additional investments, talking about our Student Success Act funding and how to respond to those recommendations that are coming out of the community engagement report.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, that's great response and great connections to make. It's interesting. There's certainly a theme among agency partners that challenge is to find those trusted local organizations and connections to families and how to support them and make connections with them because they've got the relationships that families do trust and have a history with. Okay, Kara and Tennille, both, thank you very much. We appreciate the work you do as well as you joining us for this morning. So thank you. And Colt, I'll let you introduce your success plan.
Thank you. So we're going to start with April Campbell, and she's having connectivity issues. So if she hops off, I'll do my best to cover this one. I want to say one thing about it before I hand it off to our director of the Office of Indian Ed, and that is that there is a unique aspect to the American Indian Alaska Native State Plan in that it was a state plan that is really a plan that's shared by the 9 nations and the state of Oregon and predates the Student Success Act. It was codified into law during that process, and we're thankful for that because it now receives more funding from the legislature. But it has existed for several decades in Oregon between the state and the 9 tribes. And with that, I'll pass it off to April for the details.
Thank you, Director Gill.
Welcome, April.
Welcome, thank you. And for those who may have not met me, my name is April Campbell. I'm a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, one of the nations here in Oregon. And as Colt said, I'm currently serving as the Office of Indian Ed Director. And thank you, Colt, for highlighting that. I was going to give just a really brief overview of the AIAM plan. And as Colt mentioned, it's been in existence since the 90s. We were fortunate enough back in 2015 to dust off the plan and have some FTE to actually do some implementation. But more recently, it was revised in March of 2020. And I'll put a link into the plan. But one of the things that I think is really unique about the American Indian Alaska Native State Plan is it was co-developed by several state agencies, including the Early Learning Division. So we had the Early Learning Division, we had the Youth Development Council, we had the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, we had the Teacher Standard Practice Commission, and more recently, the Educator Advancement Council add value to the plan. And so there are currently 9 objectives. Another unique thing you might not know about the plan if you haven't seen it is the plan was created from a lens of cradle to career or even cradle to grave. So when you look at the 9 objectives within the plan, and those are 9 large objectives, and then we have a lot of strategies within them, early learning is threaded throughout. And so one of the comments earlier about partnerships, we had Oregon Health Authority. I mean, all the partners that you saw the little bubbles earlier, that they all contributed to the plan and the development of the plan. But specifically, due to time, I want to pull out 3 different objectives. One is our objective number 2 is about early learning, and it's creating high quality community-based learning. We are partnering really, really closely at this time with our early learning team, specifically the Tribal Affairs Office around the Tribal Early Learning Hub. So this is a cross-agency collaboration to make that lift successful. And the next slide, please. So another thing that's happening right now, in fact, we have RFAs waiting for people to apply. So please get the word out that objective 5 is around increasing the occurrences of successful transitions, which includes early learning to kindergarten. Of course, those other critical points that we unfortunately often disengage or push out are American Indian Alaska Native students. We also made a modification in 2020, which is ironic. We didn't necessarily know that at the time that COVID was going to hit, but we knew that our students had a high suicide rates, high push out rates. And so we knew social emotional wellness and that balance of being a student within a public school system, but maybe living their own culture and their own ways of being look differently. And so when bringing the 2 together wasn't successful to our students, we wanted to focus on these transition points. So there are these transition grants available. And go to one more slide and then I'll wrap it up real quick. The other project that we're working on is our Tribal History Shared History. It was a curriculum that was adopted in law in 2017. The actual law only calls out kindergarten through 12th grade historically accurate, and you could read the rest curriculum, but we knew that there was an importance to also have curriculum that was developed at early learning. And so again, this is another collaborative partner that we're working with the Early Learning Division to create curriculum and lesson plans specific for American Indian Alaska Native students, not targeting, but focusing on our tribes here in Oregon. So those are the 3 larger projects that we have ongoing. Funding's available. Another couple things to know about the grants that we provide. Any funding that goes out of our office, there's an accountability component. So whether that's a deliverable item or ensuring that the funds were used the way that they were supposed to be, there's an evaluation component. So again, identifying, what worked well, what didn't work well. There's a withdrawing of best and promising practices. And then we also ask for, or we try to work with the entity that receives the funding on sustainability. So those are kind of our overarching themes for the funding that we provide out in these grants. The final thing I'll say is that for all of our funding that is part of our Student Success Act, early learning entities and early learning culturally responsive nonprofits, CBOs, are all included in being able to access these funds, along with school districts, along with ESDs, along with nonprofits, and along with tribes, as well as post-secondary education. But we, again, just know the importance of that kind of streamlining support from early learning to what we call cradle to career or cradle to grave. And I know that was a really quick overview, and hopefully if you have questions, let me know.
Great. Thank you.
Sue, we could spend, these plans are so in-depth and so amazing. They're kind of like Raise Up Oregon. We could spend your whole retreat on any one of these 4 plans.
Right.
So I'm going to move us on to our Assistant Superintendent, Deb Lang, and her team from the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiatives, and let Deb take it from here, and then hopefully a little time for questions after that, maybe.
Awesome. Thank you, Colt. And thank you, Chair Miller. I'm Deborah Lang. Thank you. And you are going to hear from 3 amazing specialists in my office that will talk about each of these plans. They're going to kind of align them with your goal. I believe most of them are around goal 1, and then the LGBTQ has 2 of the goals around the ELC goals. And then they'll tell you about the indicators in which we have within these plans and how they align and who's the grantees are, the fundings, and the work that is kind of going into it. Now, just because of sake of time, it is going to be a brief overview, but we will put some links also in the chat. And at any time you would like to have us back, we will be happy to accept the invitation and go into more detail. And so I'm going to first turn it over to Shalaswa Cryer, and she will talk about the African American Black Student Success Plan.
Awesome. Welcome.
Thank you guys so very much for having me. So as Deb said, I'm the coordinator for the African American Black Student Success Plan. And I will say this is a very challenging task. I've got my timer going on. And so you will hear the beeping. We will all hear the beeping when it's time for me to stop. The African American Black Student Success Plan legislation was passed in 2015. And our advisory group was also convened at that time in 2015 as well. And so you'll note on your slide, there's advisory membership. So part of the requirement in our legislation is that we have a representative from the Early Learning Division on the advisory group. So our first representative is Leanne Green, and currently Karina Guzman Ortiz. And we also have community members from who work in the early learning area, also have served from the beginning on the advisory group. The plan itself was published in 2017, and the plan is organized around grade bands. So early learning to kindergarten, kindergarten through grade 3, grade 4 to grade 8, and so on. And then for each of those grade bands, there is a list of objectives. And then for each objective, every single one, there is a list of strategies. So what you guys have on your slide here are the objectives specifically in our plan for early learning. And hopefully you guys have a chance to follow the link and take a look at the plan and see what some of the strategies are. And you'll be able to see a lot of the correlations within those strategies. Some of the core concepts going throughout all of the strategies are: 1, culturally specific approaches. So culturally specific pedagogy, curriculum, investments, assessments, partnerships with families, partnerships with community-based organizations, and then finally, partnerships as a whole. Our rules themselves require that there's partnerships with culturally specific community-based organization, and then either your early learning hub, your district, and with kindergarten program, so with the actual school districts. And like I said, you'll see that throughout all of those strategies. So for example, for strategy 1, there's also includes home visits and opportunities for parents and educators to collaborate and learn about the needs of students for early learning. Objective 2 on the culturally and linguistically responsive educational certification pathways. One key piece there is to increase the number of Black educators, but also to collaborate with the SPARK team to discuss inclusion of culturally responsive SPARK analysis and standards. The third one you'll see there, I think one of your council members mentioned earlier, is really how do we increase access for parents and families and do that in an effective way. And so, unfortunately, that's my 3 minutes. So,
wow.
And you see there's that list of some of the grantees who have served over the 2020-21 school year, over 170 students. Early learning students and families were served, and I believe it's 172 African-American Black students and families specifically. But anyway, please check out our website as well, and you'll see some of the activities. Like we have the Black Parent Initiative is really starting on that early childhood. They have a doula and lactation program, and really in facilitating the certification of that. So, and yes, if you guys ever want us to come back, I would love to get into more of this with you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we are on such a crazy timeline. It's not doing justice to any one of these presentations.
It's okay. And next we have Michael Reyes. He is over our Latino, Latina, Latinx, Indigenous Student Success Plan.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to give you a super quick background. The Latino, Latina, Latinx Student Success Plan was actually first drafted in 2020 after the SSA. And at the time, it was created as a short-term plan in response to really the early pandemic and the challenges that were created as a result of that really quick transition to remote learning. We found that many Latinx families and students struggled with that transition to distance learning and barriers associated to technology access. So that year, we awarded the interim Latinx Student Success Grants in response to these issues. Also that year, many families in Southern Oregon were impacted by the 2020 wildfires, which impacted students' learning. In 2020 that year, we awarded 7 grants for a total of $1 million. The grants were awarded to community-based organizations, a school district, and a higher ed institution. A couple of their pre-K focused programs include the Centro Latinoamericano in Lane County, offered preschool classes via asynchronous instruction in partnership with Migrant Ed. They connected families with mental health supports, and they offered a family literacy evening program. The Salem Kaiser Coalition for Equality in Marion County offered their Formando Familia Fuertes support group for families that also included mental health. Leyendo Avanzamos, a K-2 reading program, and Ready for Kindergarten. The Southern Oregon Child and Family Center in Jackson County provided their Little Learners Spanish language program via Zoom. And South Lane School District in Cottage Grove / Lane County increased staffing at their early learning center, piloted the Kids in Transition to School summer program with a specific focus on their growing Guatemalan and mom-speaking community, and provided a 10-week Making Parenting a Pleasure class. The full Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Indigenous Student Success Plan, the first phase of that was created in 2021 with a lot of feedback from our advisory group and our community partners. The overall plan addresses student success strategies and outcomes from pre-K all the way up through higher education. The 4 strategies you see listed here are the ones that are pre-K focused in their language and their potential impact. And that includes early childhood readiness, culturally responsive pedagogy, practice, and curriculum, and literacy and numeracy from K to 3rd grade, which we know is built on having those successful outcomes in pre-K. ODE will be releasing the 22-23 Latinx Student Success Grant application, hopefully later this week, and we will be hopefully awarding up to $6 million in grants once again. And I also wanted to share that we currently have 1 ELD staff person who is part of our advisory group, and that is time for me.
Thank you, Michael.
Wow. Thank you, Michael. Exciting timeline for those grants.
And last but not least, we have Angie Foster-Lawson that will talk about the LGBTQ2 SIA+.
Awesome. Welcome, Angie.
Thank you so much for having me and for making this space to share about the LGBTQ2SIA+ Student Success Plan. So this plan was developed in 2020 through a work group of community partners, student engagement sessions, and its purpose is to address barriers to educational success and make recommendations for creating safe and inclusive environments for LGBTQ2SIA+ youth, families, staff members, and the broader school community from early childhood through post-secondary education. So with the passage of SB 52 in 2021, $2 million is directed per biennium for the grant program that supports the implementation of this plan. So we haven't yet had grantees for the program. We're just getting that set up. But there is a strong alignment for early learning with the inclusive and affirming practices, because those are really an essential part of harm reduction, increasing protective factors for LGBTQ2SIA children who, we have data from OHA later on, can experience higher rates of negative mental health, suicide ideation, bullying, sexual violence, just to name a few. And of course, we have children as young as age of 2 self-identifying as gender expansive, children as young as 5 may express sexual orientation identities, and children of all ages, of course, have LGBTQ2SIA family members and education staff who serve them. So it's one reason why the early learning hubs and providers of early learning services are eligible grantees for the forthcoming grant program. So the strategies you see here listed kind of lead up to the 2 ELC goals. So first, on the green side, in order for students to arrive ready for kindergarten, caretakers and educators must work towards that vision of affirming visible support for LGBTQ2SIA students and families. And as George pointed out earlier, these adults need support themselves in order to support students. So you can see that indicator around educator training, social emotional support for themselves, as well as inclusive teaching practices that goes from K-12 through post-secondary, but of course is also essential for early learning education. And then the teacher prep programs really allow this upstream opportunity to get some of those skills happening right away for students to experience. And on the gray side, you have that coordination and action at the system level to make sure that you're serving LGBTQ2SIA youth and family-centered services and supports. So this has inclusive curriculum development. You have those channels of communication and discrimination reporting, which gets at that accountability piece that Kali mentioned, gender affirming facilities, and then of course, lastly, coordination between ODE and ELD, which we are doing right now. And so I just wanted to share lastly that the LGBTQ2SIA advisory group will soon be open for applications, and we will have a seat for ELD, or for early learning division. And there's my timer. And so I'm going to kick it back to Deb. I'm super happy to be able to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie.
And this slide was supposed to be deleted, so I apologize. We're going to just give you some more information. Here's all the initiatives for the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and we're growing weekly, it seems like. So we have a few more there that are not there, but we're always wanting to know how we could support that early learning piece to education all the way through the whole spectrum. So thank you. I don't want to take any more time. Just thank you so much for letting us talk.
Thank you, Deb, very much. Wow, Colt, you don't have much to do during the day, do you? Impressive, very impressive, Colt. Range of responsibilities and access to children and families, and your staff did a fabulous job with ridiculous timeframes, giving us great overviews.
Thank you, Sue. Clearly incredible staff. So that's how we manage it. So thank you.
Yeah.
And happy again to come back and answer questions in the future. I do have the question from Peter and Kali, and we'll circle back on that with you all.
Okay, and Council, I'm sorry we don't have time to do Q&A with these success plans. We may have some time this afternoon when we can just throw out some additional questions or thoughts about it. But at this point, it's time for us to take our now 25-minute break for lunch. And once again, I want to thank Colt and all of your staff who've been with us this morning. You all did a fabulous job. And most importantly, thanks for the great work you're doing for kids and families in the state. We greatly appreciate it. So with that, we will take a break until 12:30. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, Alyssa. Nice to see you again. Oh, that was quite a morning.
Great discussion.
Yeah.
I remember why our meetings used to go all day.
Yes, I know. It's really too bad the student success plans had to be so abbreviated. Wow. Let's see. Kali and George are both going to be a little bit late coming back. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's Ann. Okay, I think those of us who are able to get on at 12:30 are on. So let's go ahead and reconvene our meeting. Hi, Troy. Welcome. Good to see you again. So council members, if you've looked at your email this morning, you will know that Alyssa or Remy sent out a PowerPoint that Alyssa and Troy are going to be using for this part of the meeting and their presentation. So you can follow it either in front of you or on the screen. And Alyssa and Troy, I want to officially welcome you to our council meeting. Thank you for being with us, Alyssa, all morning, and Troy joining us now. Needless to say, we are very interested in your community engagement plan, in what it's for, why are you doing what you're doing, and then certainly to talk about some investment priorities. And I understand that you may not have as many answers as we have questions. So council, I think a part of this conversation is for Alyssa and Troy and the staff to just get some input back from us, or what are we thinking, and what are ideas that we have that we'd like them to consider. So just, I think, be prepared for more questions than answers at this stage in the process. So with that, Alyssa and Troy, we will turn it over to you, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Sue. And I'll say as we get going, and Remy pulls up the slides, that Lindsay Capps from the governor's office plans to join a meeting in the fall. And so there's also going to be more opportunities to speak with the governor's office directly about the governor's priorities, kind of investments and setting things up, knowing there's some pretty significant transitions happening in the governor's office and legislature next year. But wanted you to have that context. And this is definitely not the only chance to ask your questions and have these discussions. So hand it over to you, Troy.
Good afternoon, folks. I'm Troy, the Government Affairs Manager for the Early Learning Division, and I wanted to walk you through our community engagement process. But I also wanted to mention David will be joining us at the end as well to walk us through those investment priorities. Next slide, please. And I'm not sure if it's just my computer, but that slide moved really slowly when it went through, so hopefully there are no issues with the slide deck. But anyway, I just want to start with some background on the community engagement process. This is a part of a cross-agency body of work that's prioritizing the voices of communities of color and the division's key partners. We're working to identify priorities that are identified by community that will inform the policymaking and budget for the 2023 legislative session. This work began with the Racial Justice Council in 2020, and that process was led by the governor's office. The Education Recovery Committee of the RJC was the setting for community engagement before the last full session in 2020, but the governor's office this time around asked 26 agencies to establish their own work groups to continue this body of work at the agency level. Just an example of the kinds of things that come out of this process. The 2020 engagement process led to House Bill 2166, which established the Early Childhood Suspension and Expulsion Prevention Program to help maintain stable child care placements for children and families. Next slide, please.
And Troy and Alyssa, are you okay with council members interrupting you as you go through this presentation, or do you want to hold questions?
I'm completely fine with that. We do have some time at the end, but don't hesitate to stop me if you want clarification on something.
Okay, thanks, Troy.
So this is a slide that details the folks who are involved in this process. As you can see, on the agency side, we have quite a breadth of participation. We have 9 staff that are dedicated to this work, and they're all listed here. I won't run through all the names for you, but you can see who's part of that process. Next slide, please. So what is the scope of engagement for the community engagement process? So we're focused on new initiatives and improvements to existing initiatives for 23-25 biennium and beyond. But I want to highlight an opportunity in building DELC to leverage community insight and expertise as we're developing new processes and procedures from the ground up. This is a unique opportunity to do this work from the start with equity at the center. We were upfront with our engagement partners that any proposal or feedback that they gave us in this engagement process would need to be balanced against federal requirements for the early childhood sector, as well as made in the context of the development of the new agency and the transfer of the employment-related daycare program. So all that to say, like, what does the agency have the capacity to pull off for new initiatives or new investments being asked for in proposals for the 23 leg session. Next slide. This is a list of the programs that are on the table for engagement. But what I wanted to highlight with this slide is these asterisk programs here: employment-related daycare, inclusive partners, and teen parent program. These are not currently in the division's portfolio, but as of the start of the new biennium, July 1, 2023, we will be the administering agency for these programs. So we also wanted these up for engagement feedback as well. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I don't know if there's just a delay. With these long pauses, feel free to ask questions as well. Our engagement principles for this process are the division's mission and commitment to equity. So I sort of transported those out of established principles that we had at the agency. But I should also say that we're going to continue to refine these as we establish DELC. So there's still some work for our mission, vision, and values. We have a separate work group that's pulling together the external engagement pieces for that. But I wanted to call out 2 emboldened parts of our mission and commitment to equity that will inform our work in community engagement. And as I said here, these 2 emboldened parts are listed. We recognize that in order for each and every child and family to learn and thrive, we have to provide equitable and differentiated person-centered resources and support. And then down below, cultural responsiveness describes the capacity to respond to the issues of diverse communities. It thus requires knowledge and capacity at different levels of intervention and service delivery: systemic, organizational, professional, and individual. Next slide. So our engagement principles underlie our engagement objectives. And our hope is that together with community partners, we can arrive at transformative outcomes as a result of this engagement process by setting achievable goals and developing policy and budget priorities that are rooted in equity, anti-racist, and child and family focus. We also want to ensure that this opportunity is a safe space for community members that's accessible to all participants. And the way that we've hoped to ensure this is by establishing group agreements that were offered by the participants in this process and then adopted. Next slide, please. So this list here shows the full invite list for the community engagement process. Our hope in putting this together was that this group's diversity could reflect the linguistic, geographic, ethnic, and racial diversity of the state of Oregon. So you'll see different organizations represented here from all parts of the state. I do want to distinguish between the 2 colors here. The organizations in brown are organizations that participate regularly. So we have about half of the folks that we've invited who are regular participants in this process. But any of the folks listed there have received an invitation to participate. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Troy, what does that mean, have received an invitation to participate? Does that mean they've gotten an email from you, or they've been invited to?
So I reached out to them. Yep, exactly. And I'm sorry, I'm getting an unstable connection. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, and I can jump in, Troy. So they continue to be on the calendar appointment. So sometimes folks are able to drop in. So these are the kind of most consistent participants in Brown, but everybody listed here has received an invitation. They get all the follow-up materials and they're invited to every session that we're holding.
And so is this like a monthly session, Alyssa, or?
It's every other week. Yep. For an hour.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we've heard, and we're not the only ones who've heard this, is just the challenge of making time, recognizing that many of the organizations on this list don't necessarily have paid staff whose job it is to kind of attend these sessions. And so one of the things that we'll talk about as we think about funding, but that all agencies are really struggling with, is how can we adequately compensate participants? If you're a lobbyist, or an advocate, this is your role. But if you're really kind of a grassroots organization, or you'll notice we have Preschool for All, we have Adelante Mujeres, they're service providers that are trying to give their time and expertise. Education Explorers is another one. So finding a way to better support participation is something all agencies are looking at.
And something that I will highlight in our investment priorities as well. Thanks for mentioning that, Alyssa.
And sorry for perhaps ignorance on my part, but what do you talk about with them for 1 hour every other week?
So if we go to the next slide, I can get
okay. Thank you.
So this is our engagement process. And this is I broke this up into 3 phases to sort of guide toward the central goal, which is having this process inform our legislative agenda for 23. So getting to your question about what we talk about on a biweekly basis, in phase 1 of this process, which spanned from, I think our first meeting was January 26th through February. This was where we had the opportunity to set the process, the timeline, and then the rules for engagement. So they co-developed this frequency that we meet, the amount of time that we spend together, and then what engagement looks like. We also, in this particular phase, shared with our engagement partners in the budget process key terms that they'll need to know when thinking about feedback for us to improve service delivery and program administration, and then where their participation in this engagement process fits in with developing the agency request budget and the governor's recommended budget. Also, we wanted to familiarize them with the division's funding sources and then what projects are currently budgeted. So they had some context for the kind of feedback or proposals they might offer the division. In phase 2, which is what we're at the tail end of now, this was an opportunity to get feedback from our community partners on what we'd shared with them regarding budget. We've also reviewed our current programs and the capacity for new initiatives with them. And then finally, where we are, as I'm presenting before you today, is we're developing and refining a list of priorities that will carry forward into phase 3, which is integrating their proposals or feedback into our LEDGE agenda. So in the next phase, over the next couple of months, we're going to, present back to our engagement partners what we've heard from them to ensure that we're on the same page, and then take those proposals and integrate them into our agency request budget, and if need be, adopt them into LEDGE concepts for the 2023 session. Next slide, please. I believe Alyssa was going to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. So we had this sort of shows a spectrum that the Racial Justice Council uses for really defining the different levels of engagement. And so you can see here that our goal was really to focus on the first 4 phases with really trying to live in that collaborate space and sharing power with community, with long-term goals of reaching to a space of empowerment and really allowing community to drive and own the work. I think one of the challenges that we've faced and that we know other agencies have faced is the timeline. So as Troy mentioned, the kind of different phases, there's key dates in there around legislative concepts, policy option packages that we can't move, that we can't change. They're set forward by the Department of Administrative Services and the Chief Financial Office. And so, as well as the legislature. And so, starting this process this year didn't allow for a lot of time to engage the way we would like to really actually hold collaborative space and share power with community. So we wanted to be realistic on 2 fronts. One, what we could commit to as an agency, recognizing that we're building DELC and that takes a fair amount of capacity. While we did receive a lot of positions, it's also predicated on using existing capacity to stand up the agency, and also where we intend to go as we establish DELC and really try to build an agency that's rooted in racial equity, racial justice, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And also want to acknowledge that we don't feel like we're living in the collaborate space as much as we would like to. Some of what we've heard from this group is, they'd at least rather be in that consult and involve at a minimum. And so there's been a little bit more of us coming with our lists and getting reactions and less of the kind of blank slate. If we could do anything in the world, what would we create? I think our hope is that by starting this process and building trust with community, this is something that can be maintained and help us start thinking about 25, 27 and get to a place where, especially as the Early Learning Council and you all are thinking of the next phase of Raise Up Oregon, this could be a great opportunity for us to kind of lift up some of that community voice and make sure that you're hearing some of the hopes, dreams, and desires for community when it comes to early care and education and the early learning system. I think you can go to the next slide.
Can I just jump in there? Because I really appreciate what you just said, Alyssa, because the building of relationships and true engagement takes time. You're absolutely right about building trust. And so it is really a two-way process. And as you indicate that you're hearing people and respecting what they say and giving back to them and making changes as a result of what you are hearing, that trust will be built over time. And I just appreciate your time perspective on this and your sort of the nuances with the way that you're thinking about building relationships so that people can really hear, you can know that they're heard, and so that you can give back and recognize that they're heard. So I just really appreciate that perspective.
Thanks, Anne. And yeah, Kali, I see your hand is up.
I know it's a little late, so I think this is great, and I think the organizations are great that you're engaging. I'm wondering if you have a similar process of engagement with the hubs. And as I've been traveling around to different hubs and listening to different folks around the state, it's a different group of people than that list of people. I think both obviously have very valuable input. And yeah, just curious if you have a process of hub engagement or bringing hubs together to provide similar feedback and input on things.
Yeah, absolutely, Kali. I think that is a place that we want to better define, especially as we're bringing on the 2 hub coordinator positions. And so I think that's a place that we can definitely improve upon in making sure we are bringing in the regional perspective and the kind of convener role that hubs play. And Troy, anything that you'd want to add to would welcome.
Also, we do have the biweekly early learning advocates meeting where hubs and CCR and ours are represented as well. And although the level and intensity of engagement does not look the same for the early learning advocates biweekly Thursday meeting as it does for this process, they have heard very many of the same bits of information regarding what our proposed ledge agenda will be for 2023, and have had the opportunity to give us feedback and have given us feedback in our most recent Thursday meeting. So we do have the setting, it just looks a little different. But I also wanted to recognize that the seed for this idea actually wasn't from the ERC or the governor's office or Racial Justice Council. It actually came from Kali. Kali reached out to me last October and was like, hey, do we have anything that's a set and regular table for communities of color to engage the division? And I said, no, it's typically something that we do on an ad hoc basis. So really this seed was planted by Kali, and she helped me to develop the invitation list. And this sort of morphed since the governor's office had required the 26 agencies to engage in this process. We sort of pulled those two pieces together into this group. So special thank you to Kali for reaching out to us on that.
Yes, thank you, Kali. And I'll say too, because this is not the same process we went through last session, and Kali was a participant in this, but when the Racial Justice Council was first created and the 5 subcommittees, I think now 6 subcommittees, including the Education Recovery Committee, were convened, that committee elected to meet, I believe we met every other week for 4 hours at a time for about a month and a half. And so we were doing evening meetings and Saturday meetings to get through the bulk of the work, because you were in a similarly crunched time frame of meeting end of September with the governor's budget having to be delivered by December 1. And so I share that as a comparison, not to make any statements about the level of commitment to the work, but just to illustrate the lift that's required to really understand the complexities of state government, the bureaucracy that exists, and the opportunities to really shift and change how we do business. And I think the other thing that we're really hoping we can leverage and partner with this table around is the process and procedure development that we're going to be doing across the ELD as we become DELC. That's there are many projects in the 45 projects that A&M helped us identify that are just about processes and procedure. And that's where we feel like there's actually a pretty big opportunity to help us infuse equity and establish it at the foundation, because what we do every day has a direct effect on how equitable our practices are. And so while as we go through kind of our considerations for next biennium, you'll notice there's not a lot of new work. That is in part because of our capacity and being honest about it. We've also heard from community, like, let's not do something new, let's just do what you do better. And I think a big piece of that will be our internal operations, as well as the external work that we want to shift and make more accessible. So wanted to just mention that as well. I think you can go to the next slide, Remy. So we've broken these down into some buckets for you all. And I would say these are all preliminary. So these are things that we're considering. We're doing the work behind it to really understand what these would look like. But one of the things that we've heard loud and clear, I think, from this community engagement table, but from our own staff as well, is the need to revisit the funding formulae for Preschool Promise, OPK, and Healthy Families Oregon in particular. So we want to look at a few things. These are just a couple of examples. Revisiting the transportation enhancement, looking at how we could build in additional supports for programs that are serving children experiencing disabilities and on IFSPs. Again, really trying to support inclusive settings, but also recognizing the supports that educators need to do that work well. And then how do we talk about wages and benefits? I think we were really excited to hear the legislature raise this issue and fund it for Relief Nurseries and Healthy Families Oregon, and acknowledge the wage issue. And we also want to recognize that we just talk about wages and we don't talk about the benefits and all the other supports that our early care and education educators need. And so what this looks like, we don't know yet, but we want to really understand, what do we think it would take to fund these programs in a way that is more responsive to what it actually takes to run these programs well, and ideally to set some sort of precedent that as we come back every legislative session, to expect that we're going to come back with a request to increase wages, because we know that they continue to raise in K-12. We need to have similar levers to do that in early care education. And David, I see you're off mute if you wanted to add something there.
No, I was just getting ready for the next slide.
Okay. Okay. So the other piece is program expansion. So again, preliminary, but as of right now, no program is off the table. We really want to look at what it would take to not just change how we fund our programs, but continue to add slots and expand service delivery through all of our programs. And then we've called out explicitly Baby Promise expansion as something we're looking at. This was something that we talked about doing last session, just recognizing the ups and downs of the revenue forecast, didn't think was feasible. This is currently only federally funded. So while the program does exist in statute, there are no state dollars behind it. So we're exploring whether we think this is a good time to propose requesting some state level investment to expand services beyond the 3 pilot regions that we're currently working with. Next slide. And David, I think you're kicking off the beginning of this.
Thank you. So I think as Troy mentioned when we had the list of programs, that there were also the STAR programs that included programs that are not currently administered by the Early Learning Division by the Department of Early Learning and Care starting July 1st, 2023. And, I think the largest of those programs I think you're all aware of is employment-related daycare, our child care assistance program for working families. So House Bill 3073, in addition to creating Department of Early Learning and Care and moving ERDC to DELC, also made significant policy changes to employment-related daycare around eligibility for the program, expanded hours to give parents more flexibility for students to access the program, also for children who are undocumented. We've been working closely with ODHS in the implementation for those programs. Almost all of those implementation run through various IT systems, including One Eligibility, and there are lots of other programs that are needing changes to that system. So we've been working to develop implementation timelines for those programs, for those eligibility changes, and some of that's going to stretch by necessity past July 1st, 2023. But I think in terms of the legislative session and funding, while HB 3073 included those expansions of eligibility, that legislation did not include any new funding for employment-related daycare. So we're looking at the need to make sure that there's additional resources on the table, so that if there are additional families who now have access to the program, that they can actually get access, right? Because it's a funding cap program, so we can only serve families until the program runs out of funding, or make sure that we don't run out of funding. So I think the concern is, without additional resources, that becomes a reality if we're expanding the number of families who are eligible.
And David, just a quick question. Don't we know that more families are going to be eligible?
So, yes. I mean, so I think what we don't know is how many families will actually take advantage of that increased eligibility. So, under our current eligibility rules, it's only about 17% of families that who are currently eligible that access employment-related daycare. So, I think so. I think there's some additional work around that. And some of these other policy changes may also make the program more desirable for some of the families who are currently eligible, but aren't currently accessing it. So I think there's a lot of different sort of moving parts on that piece. I think that's something where our team at ELD meets regularly with the folks at ODHS who work on the program, but also their fiscal folks that we're constantly monitoring caseload, cost per case, and what the funding is.
I just add to David, just to, I think, put a finer point. What we're trying to do is we're very close to the caseload cap right now. And so we're anticipating that by the time we reach session, we will be at, or maybe getting to a place of needing a reservation list. And so these funds are really to ensure that we can serve the newly eligible families and not just move them to a reservation list now that they're eligible.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
So the other piece that we're looking at is part of this under ERDC administration. So as part of a move of employment-related daycare to the new agency, there are still quite a number of functions that will need to be performed by Oregon Department of Human Services for a variety of reasons, right? When eligibility and the eligibility offices were designed so that families can enroll simultaneously for SNAP, TANF, and child care assistance, so we don't want to disrupt it. And there's all sorts of other functions that I think, based on our shared analysis with ODHS, makes sense for those functions to continue at the Oregon Department of Human Services. So we're going to need to contract back to Department of Human Services for those functions, and we're looking at that, what that will entail, and we may need to consider asking the legislature for some funding to support some of that work. And then finally in the list is child welfare involved families. So one of the changes, one need that's been discussed for quite a long time, but actually didn't end up formally in HB 3073 is support for child care assistance, help with child care for foster care families and families involved in the child welfare system. We hear this in listening sessions. We've heard this, when we talk to our colleagues in child welfare. I would say that we're sort of early stages of working with ODHS, both on the self-sufficiency side of the house, but also on the child welfare house, to think about what this would actually look like and how to make this, the best support that we can provide. Also thinking about not just children that are placed in foster care, but how do you also provide supports for families that have an in-home safety plan. So I think we're working with child welfare to really think about how to do that. And I would say this, I think this is a beginning of a much longer conversation that we need to have and want to have on what's our role as Department of Early Learning Care and the portfolio of programs that we administer to support that kind of work and really support the goals of family preservation. And then next on the list, facilities and supply building. So I don't think this is an unfamiliar topic for this group. I know that you, as council, when you had your retreat, identified facilities as a barrier to expanding the supply of childcare. We all know that there aren't dedicated funds for facilities, and even beyond that, virtually every single dollar that is associated with early childhood and early learning has prohibitions on using it for capital investments. So I think this is an ongoing need. I know there's conversations happening within the advocacy community. So I think also just a lot of work in addition to knowing this is a need of what's the best way to make those resources available. Also, I think recognizing that ELD and DELC, this will not really be our sphere of expertise of how to manage capital investments.
Thanks, David. The next one that we're looking into is expansion of the infant early childhood mental health consultation model, formerly known as the Early Childhood Suspension and Expulsion Prevention Program. So the challenge here, of course, is that we anticipate actually seeing the service delivery in about February of 23, but recognizing that the suspension and expulsion ban will take effect in 2026, we think it's important to look at regional capacity to continue expanding the service. The report that PSU conducted for us really indicated ideal caseload caps for the regional supports and the mental health consultants. So using that information, we want to look at how we could grow some additional supply on the ground so that we have enough infrastructure stood up in time to support providers when the ban takes effect. So that's another one that we're in the early stages of exploring what that would look like, what that would cost, what the capacity is on the ground to actually fulfill the need and be able to utilize additional resources going forward. And next slide, please. And I think I'm handing it back to David and Troy.
Thank you. So the first piece, Fellowship for Career Growth, this is actually a new initiative that we're in the early stages of exploring, something that we received a little bit of funding for in our preschool development, federal preschool development grant. And it's actually really being led by Karina Gutzman in the Early Learning Division. So I think the idea is, how do we diversify who's at the state tables, who are the folks at the Early Learning Division who are at those policy making tables, and provide a pathway for folks working directly in the field, in communities, with children, to have those career opportunities, and actually even an understanding of what those career opportunities look like, so we can really diversify who's making those policy divisions, potentially at Department of Early Learning and Care, and also, hopefully, the idea may be to think about this for partner state agencies. So as part of the Federal Preschool Development Grant, we've been able to contract with Metropolitan Group to do some initial planning on what the kind of supports in a cohort and a fellowship model might look like, really still in the sort of conceptual stage, and I think will be for the next 6 months. I think the idea is that we'd want to pilot this small, probably just within the Early Learning Division as a first cohort, to really learn from that experience. And we do have resources through the Preschool Development Grant to pilot that with one cohort next year. But I think the idea is, while we're still in the early stages, I think there's a real interest in what are those things that we could be doing, those kinds of investment strategies to really provide that meaningful career pathway from the field to working in those policy-making decisions roles within our organization, and if we're successful, to see if we can partner with other agencies or parts of Radius Oregon to continue that model.
And then the next,
and actually, I think to Kali's question, I think the answer is definitely yes. And again, I think we've just been a little bit slow, in part because of the pandemic and the things around that, of getting that launch. But I think that's something we'd really love to continue a conversation around with the Early Learning Council.
And just so the audience knows what the question is Kali asked in the chat, is that something you want the ELC to be thought partners with you on regarding the fellowship for career?
Thank you, Troy.
And then on to the next item here, BIPOC community engagement resources. If we just sort of rewind back to our conversation on who the folks are that are participating in this process, Alyssa had raised that many of the folks who are participating in this engagement opportunity are not lobbyists or professional advocates. This is not a part of their job description, if you will. They work in service delivery, they're childcare providers. We want to honor the time and effort that they put into this process. This is something that has come up for many agencies, including ELD, about having some sort of funding stream for compensation or some type of stipend to honor the work and time that these folks are putting into this process. So this investment priority is following up on something that we've heard from our engagement partners, as well as an issue that we see rising across agencies with establishing an engagement forum as robust as the one that's in this BIPOC community engagement process. Next slide.
So this last slide really just focuses a little bit more just on making sure that DELC will have some of that internal capacity to do some of the work that we need to do. So I think the first one, Research and Evaluation Fund, currently all of the resources that we have to conduct any research or program evaluation are in some sense sort of histories of the accident of when a program initial legislation was passed and whether the legislature decided to allocate any funds or not to support that evaluation. We don't have any dollars outside of those for addressing other research needs or to sort of think about research questions that cross programs. So I think the idea is just, really, if we want to have that commitment to data and research based decision making, we really do need some resources in order to make that happen. For those of you who have been involved in the council for a while, the Healthy Families Oregon database may sound familiar. This is an ongoing need where some attempted solutions have not been successful in the past, but it is something that we do require in order to just even at the basic level maintain our accreditation with Healthy Families America. And again, unless legislature actually allocates resources to do something like this, we actually don't have funds for it. And then I think, Alyssa, I was going to hand it to you for the last two.
Yeah, great. So we received 86 positions last session in February, including 12 limited duration to permanent requests. I had made a commitment to the legislature to be very transparent in the future about position needs. But we do have some limited duration positions that we had funding for through this biennium, but would need additional funding to maintain from previous grant applications and funding we'd received. So we plan to request those permanently. There were also 5 positions that we had deferred that we'd identified as a need, particularly to support the employment-related daycare program and childcare assistance work that's coming over that we plan to request. And we're in the process now of determining what other capacity is needed, since our requests this last session were really focused on the new functions of DELC. So you'll remember primarily building out our chief operating officer unit, building out our IT team, and building out our chief of staff and kind of those shared service models, but not looking at our program team, not looking at the Office of Child Care. So really making sure we're being honest about what we need to be successful. And then the last thing that we're looking at, probably no surprise, but we're still finding little things that need to be cleaned up as we're establishing DELC. So we do plan to have another kind of cleanup that will take a look at the authority, making sure we've got everything in place that we need to really stand up and be ready on July 1 and do all the work required of us. So no, that was a lot. And we have 3 minutes for questions.
So Alyssa, on those positions with 86 to fill, how is the recruitment and hiring process going?
Great. We're moving through, I believe we have 22 positions hired, and we've had about 40 in some stage of recruitment. So we're making our way through. We've seen really great recruitment pools. So it's a shout out to our recruiter who's working very hard to give us kind of the support needed to do this work well. We have had some failed recruitments, I think, where many agencies are struggling is in kind of the operational field. So the budget, accounting, grant positions, but a procurement, but we're making our way through and slowly building that team. We're in the process right now of hiring our chief operating officer. We actually just announced on Monday that Serena Studemeyer Wesley will be joining as our chief of programs and deputy director. So for any of you who've worked with Serena in the past, she's currently the chief cultural change officer for the state. So we're very excited to have her join in June. And once we have her on board and our COO, that will round out our executive leadership team. So as I'm 4 days away from 1 year in, we've almost got our full executive team.
Congratulations, Alyssa. That's blinding speed, in some arenas. Wow. Okay. Questions from council members for Alyssa, David, Troy, or input for them as they go through all of these community engagement sessions, listening sessions, etc. But when you look at these priority considerations that we've got in front of us, What are your thoughts, council members, from your experience?
Sue, can I jump in now just because I sort of want to just sort of react to our last few hours together, because I do have to leave early, and so I really apologize. And so some of my thoughts are relevant specifically to what Alyssa and David and Troy were talking about, but also generally. My first point is, I think this question of the fact that there's a lot of money and no capacity to carry it out and implement it is really just huge. And I think all of us are feeling it all the time. I hear you, Alyssa, that you haven't been able to hire the people, even though you have, however many positions that you have open. I appreciated somebody today who said, we're all stealing from each other, and so I think what that has something to do about the tempo and the pace of implementation that we all have to be aware of, and that there's a lot of money and no ability to spend it, no capacity to absorb it, no capacity to implement the programs well. And somehow this is the context. I mean, it's a great problem to have, but it's a really bizarre problem to have. And so somehow we have to develop a mindset and a philosophy for operating that really seriously takes into account the reality of where we are. So that's one point. And I can hear you doing that, but I just feel like I don't think we can overstate it. I work for a foundation and nobody needs our money. It's kind of weird. Now, it's not exactly true, obviously, because in fact, this is a moment when philanthropy funds are much more flexible and can somehow help unlock a lot of the other constraints that are put on the public sector dollars that I think are really important. So that what we were talking about this morning in terms of collaboration and all of those kinds of things, that's to me a role for philanthropic dollars. But I do think it requires us all to be thinking differently, and obviously you all are, but I just think it's a really powerful point. And now a couple of other points that I just want to make, because I have the floor and I have to leave early, is this whole question that we've had today about the role of the early learning hubs and how we're going to build their capacity, use them, understand that they are all at different places, but that they are the institutional vehicle that we have to implement so much of what we're talking about. I think it means that's another thing that we just have to stop and take really seriously and say, what's our strategy going to be? And I appreciate, I think, Khalid, whatever you were saying, like, are the other agencies recognizing that they have to invest in these hubs? And again, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the role of philanthropy. We obviously fund our early learning hub to do things that it isn't otherwise funded to do, but we keep trying to sort of make sure that it can be the facilitator, the convener, and so on. And so my second point is, I think that we got something here that we got to deal with and that we have to address as the Early Learning Council in partnership with the ELD and Dept, because it's up to us, I think, to kind of figure this out, because we got to just take it on as an issue. And then the last thing I want to just say before I leave is I loved the presentation from ODE about reaching out to the specific communities and how the specific African American communities and Latinx communities and the LGBTQ2SI+ communities. And one of the things that struck me is that Angie, who talked about the LGBTQ2SI+ communities, in that one, there was a specific call out to the social emotional needs of both the teachers and the students. And it's not that it wasn't in the others. I'm sure it was implied in the others, but you know how sometimes when you're focusing on one group that has particular needs, it sort of shines a light on things that we should be doing for all kids better all the time. And the fact that they called it out made me think, I know it's implied in everything else, but so those, I'm just taking advantage of my moment in the sun here to make all of those broader comments. But I know Alyssa, Troy, David, you think about those all the time, but that's what I'm sort of taking away from our discussion, this incredibly rich meeting today. I just can't believe how much we got today from you. And so thank you very much for this.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. Those are great comments before you have to take off. And, you know, one thought that goes through my mind is the fact that at our last council meeting, the council committed to trying to be a convener for a place to start figuring out how do we pull the home visiting programs together and services. So I look at that as sort of a, you know, a experiment, figuring out what is the council's role and how do we help set these tables or pull programs together from different agencies, which is part of what you're suggesting, and that the hubs can do as well. And the hubs will be an important part of that home visiting conversation too. So I think this is relatively new territory for the council, but I see us getting quite focused on it over the next several months, and certainly heading into the retreat in October. So thanks for your time.
Sue, I know this is near and dear to your heart, and maybe I learned this from you, but anyway, I think it's really critical for us to deal with it. Yeah.
I think that's kind of why we're here, as I see it. So thank you, Anne, and thanks for being on this call as long as you could be. Okay, Kali.
So just in relation, I don't have anything quite as eloquent in summary of everything, but I do want to just say, in terms of the considerations and what I'm hearing, the facilities thing is a huge deal. And I know Children's Institute is looking at this. We literally don't have the ability to expand childcare and preschool in the ways that we want to in many communities throughout Oregon because we don't have space. And it's just a fact. And so I hope that you definitely request dollars to invest in that. And I think we have to be creative. I think we need to think about how we engage the private sector and just other sectors that deal in the built environment to be thinking about and prioritizing facilities. I think government has a role to play. There are many government buildings, like the supply is an issue. So anything that could catalyze growth and creativity and thinking about it, I think is helpful. The other piece, similarly, the workforce, early childhood mental health. Listen, I know you and I have had many conversations about it. A lot of the stuff that this council supported around suspension and expulsion requires that we have supports for staff and behavior supports. We don't also have capacity or really a pipeline to the degree that we need. So it requires, again, creativity, thinking about home visitors and other people who do things with children and families, how they can have a pathway towards becoming, you know, it shouldn't require a master's degree in behavioral health to do some of the coaching and things that are needed, but the system just doesn't have it right now. And because we've talked about trusts and all those things and different many, I would say most marginalized or oppressed communities of any sort have issues with trust. We hear it in our rural and in our urban areas, in communities of color and in white communities. And so we have to figure out a way to build relationship and expand, like really invest meaningfully. So I just was happy to see the investment. I think we need significant investment. And I'm excited if we are able to, how we can be creative and how the council can think about these pipelines to build capacity to support children and staff in the ECE space.
And if it's okay, I just want to make one note around facilities and a gesture to the May meeting. So one of the things that did come out of the last legislative session was 10 million to support co-location of early learning facilities and affordable housing development. And Oregon Housing Community Services was asked by the legislature to come up, do a report on implementation and what that would look like, and take that to the e-board to release those funds. So they contracted with Lyft. There's a great report. We can send the link, but I think our plan is they will be joining us at the May meeting to report on that work and their recommendations for how that 10 million would be used. So I know that's a narrow, it's just a part of the puzzle, but I think it might be just interesting in terms of not only that bringing together affordable housing and early learning, but just as a early model of how to go about creating funding for early learning facilities. So just flag that for the May meeting.
Also wanted to add to a comment that Kali made about facilities and the work that CI is doing. I'm going to be joining hopefully those conversations as well, so that we can pull together the thinking around what the ask might be for next session. For both the external process that's going on with the facilities conversation and then what we're thinking about as well. Also, we have to contextualize this with, like, we don't know what the next gubernatorial administration's priority is going to be. So hopefully we're not limited by that, but that's something that I want to continue to highlight as we engage our external partners on what our priorities are for next session.
Yeah, good point, Troy. Really good point. And I guess just one thing, I don't want to lose track of, it was the last slide, the technical fixes, but you know, I think data is going to become increasingly important. And one of the council's original objectives was that we want to make data-driven decisions and invest in programs where we've got results to show and outcomes. And I just think we need to keep that on the council's agenda, whatever that might mean. And David, you and I have talked about what's a dashboard for the council look like, and when are we going to be able to develop one? But I think that's another piece that I know I've talked to some other council members about, wanting that accountability built into our own work, as well as what's happening in the field. So any other comments for this discussion, which is really on how we're getting input, how staff is getting input from the community, and budget priorities to consider for 23-25. Peter.
Just very quickly, and just thank you. I'm so glad these discussions are underway. I think Kali summarized my perspective as well, in terms of just very grateful that the discussions on infrastructure are happening. But and also on the just emphasize on the behavioral health front. I'm really glad that you're looking, Alyssa, at each region's capacity, because that's just a huge concern. We're struggling with it constantly. Nobody has the capacity. So that's a huge question for us to be able to resolve. So thank you for doing this work. Thank you for keeping us informed. Is the Portland State study something that was already sent to us, or could we access the Portland State study?
Yes, I will send you the report. I think is 140 pages. There's like a 15-page executive summary. So we'll drop it in the chat and make sure that you get it after the meeting.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Alyssa. Yeah, I've asked Remy to send us everything that's in the chat, because there are a whole bunch of links and George's summary and all of that. So we'll get that following the meeting. Okay, thank you all. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about this in the months ahead. Thanks, Troy. Bye-bye. I'm guessing David and Alyssa will still hang out. Okay, Alyssa, do you want to, or David, introduce kind of the next piece here?
How about I can do that? I think we have Kayla up next, if that's right. We've been really lucky to have Kayla join us, join the Early Learning Division through June of this year, to really help on the big lift to make sure that we're ready on the transfer of the ERDC, the migration of the rules for employment-related daycare from ODHS to DELC, as well as making sure that when DELC is launched, that we sort of have, and I've been calling this, I don't think it's the right term, the generic rules that you need to have as a functioning agency. So not the program specific rules, but just sort of those sort of higher level rules for the functioning of the agency. So Kayla's just going to give you a little bit of a overview of the work that she's been digging into. To be honest, it'll probably be at least a year before you guys actually take action on any of this, but we wanted to keep you informed on the work as it moves forward.
Okay, thanks, David, and welcome, Kayla. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Councilmember. Remy, are you able to pull up the slides? Excellent. So as David mentioned, I just wanted to pop on and say thank you for allowing me to kind of update you and keep you abreast of the rule work that's going to be happening in the next 14 months or so. Remy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So just the things that I want to cover is just a very high level overview of the implications for rule work out of HB 3073, which is why we're here, and then talk a little bit about what's going to happen to your current set of rules so that you guys have a good sense of any implications for those. Talk a little bit about what you might need to think about taking action on in the next 14 months or so, any next steps from our perspective, and then if you have any questions, happy to take those, or I provide my email, so I'm happy to take follow-ups as well. Remy, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, so HB 3073, as I'm sure you guys are aware, maintains rulemaking authority with the Early Learning Council. So even as the division transitions into the department, you all will maintain all of your same responsibilities and tasks related to rulemaking for the department. It's also giving you a little bit more latitude to adopt rules regarding early childhood and learning programs. And some of those rules are going to be more of the administrative pieces, as David mentioned, and I'll get a little bit into that in a couple of slides, or they're going to be more specific to programs. You aren't going to, I think, see a lot of big shifts in your, like actual operations of how you engage with rules, but the scope of what you might regulate is going to increase a little bit. Any questions on that? If not, Remy, happy for you to move us forward. So regarding the division's current rules, everything that you have today or that you adopt, amend, repeal, etc., from now until July 1 of 2023 will carry automatically over to DELC. That's all facilitated by some very back-end processing with the Secretary of State and the division. So there's nothing needed from the council to facilitate that transfer, but we just did want to make you aware that everything that you have or are going to amend will carry over to DELC. There should be no worries about any sort of program interruption or a gap in authority. And there should also be no real concern about there being a gap in rulemaking ability. Your rulemaking ability will be the same day to day, even as you transition into the new department. Is there any questions about that? I know it's more of a technical aspect, but I did want to provide that sort of security about the current rules. Okay, Remy, if you'd move us forward. So the first piece of the new rulemaking actions that will likely come up as you stand up DELC are those types of rules that help the agency kind of run as an agency. If you were to peel away the programs like pre-K or relief nurseries or any of those types of things, an agency still has certain statutory requirements or operational requirements that require some rule work to occur. A good example of that is every state agency is required to comply with the Public Records Act. Every agency is also kind of required to set forth those parameters in which the public or interested parties can request records from an agency. So those are the types of rules that David was speaking of when he was thinking about those procedural rules. So we are currently working to see what the Oregon Department of Education has, so that anything that you might currently be under ODE right now doesn't get lost when we move to DELC, or, you know, if we don't need it, we make sure that we don't take it with us. And we're making sure that we're checking like the boxes on overarching statutory requirements or model rules coming out of the Department of Justice. So there may be some procedural type rulemakings that you all will need to consider in the next 14 months. And those are really to help the agency fire on all cylinders on day one. Are there any questions about those types of rules or the rulemaking that's coming down the pike in that vein? Okay, Remy, if you'd move us forward. The second type of new rulemaking that you will probably be likely engaging in for DELC is the rules that you are going to need to acquire from other departments. So the classic example for this is the ERDC program that currently lives with ODHS. They have a pretty voluminous rule set that governs the program. In order to actually absorb that program and retain the proper legal underpinnings to actually govern and administer the program, the Early Learning Council is going to have to adopt its own rule set that sets out the parameters, the criteria, the requirements, et cetera, for the ERDC program. And so we've already started working with ODHS on that transfer. We've been working with them for about 4 months. And so we're in the process of kind of culling out the specific rules from their OER chapter and designing our own rule set that kind of reflects where the program is. And so I just wanted to let you know that this will be another kind of large component of the rulemaking that the council will need to engage in order to kind of stand up the programs that DELC will be inheriting. Any questions on that piece? David, any additions?
I think the one thing I would just add, as part of that process, we're also looking at, where there maybe sort of some policy conversations and policy choices, that we'd like to bring to the councils. So I think our first goal is to make sure that the rules are in place July 1st, 2023, so that there's no disruption in services to children's families and providers. But I think it is an opportunity to also look at the rules and think about where there are opportunities to improve things for children and families. That being said, I think the other constraint that we're needing to be really thoughtful about is almost any change to a rule involving eligibility or eligibility processes impacts IT systems, including the one eligibility system. And, we know that there is already a backlog of change requests for one eligibility through the remainder of the biennium. So there may be things that we flag for further discussion, but we'll need to sort of put on pause past July 1st, past that transition date because of those constraints, right? So we can't make a change in rules that can't be implemented in the system. So that's part of what we're also trying to work through as part of this process. And I just also wanted to add just a huge thanks to Kayla, because she's just been doing a huge amount of very detailed, painstaking work behind the scenes to help make sure that we actually have a successful and seamless transition.
Oh, thank you, Kayla. I know that you're an expert and staff did not have the capacity anywhere to do this. So we appreciate you stepping in.
Absolutely happy to help. It's a great team and it's a very laudable goal. So I'm happy to be a part of it.
Now, did you make a comment that you're only here till June? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, David did. I'm expected to be here through midsummer. And that's the current status quo.
Okay. Well, David hasn't dropped over in a faint yet, so I don't know why not. So a question I have for either Kayla or David is I assume that we're not going to just not hear anything about this for a year, but somehow we'll be informed along the way. Is that correct? Since we're going to have to adopt a bunch of rules.
Yes, Remy, if you wouldn't mind clicking over to the next slide. And David, if I maybe can go over some high level next steps and you can augment. So next steps for really all of the rules, both the really intensive ODHS set and then also some of those more administrative components, is that we're going to continue to do our due diligence internally to figure out like the universe of provisions, rule sets, et cetera, that are required to make the department whole, so to speak. We're going to continue our work with ODHS. The work with ODHS is, I just want to flag also a two-part, like it's two sides of the same coin. ODHS is going to need to repeal their rule set as DELC adopts their own rule set. And so we need to stay very much in step with ODHS as we continue this rulemaking process. And then this third bullet here, I think gets to your question, which is next steps in terms of how are we going to think about like circulating drafts and engaging with stakeholders and our partners and making sure that the rules are in line with the mission, vision, and values of DELC. And I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunities to start a very intentional dialogue between ourselves, our partners, council members about those drafts and really work to refine them. And I think a lot of that work is going to be done, or a lot of the attention paid to the rule work coming down the pike is going to be on this ERDC rule set.
But we pledge that we're not going to bring you 400 pages in rules in September and say, adopt them, right? So I think this was just meant to really start the conversation. You know, we're coming over a year in advance so that we can start thinking about what's that process to bring you along in these conversations and, you know, hear from you what you need to feel in a good place to really engage in the rulemaking, because it is voluminous, you know, and some of it is unbelievably technical.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kayla. We do appreciate you a lot. A quick question maybe for Alyssa or David. I know that there's a whole nother effort to update, revise our childcare rules. So, right, that's been going on for about a year. So consolidate, simplify, whatever. So how does that relate to this conversation about rulemaking and DELC?
I would say there's not a lot of overlap. So the process isn't getting shifted because we now have to factor in DELC. What we're looking at is how we make sure that DELC has authority statutorily so that we don't have to go through and necessarily make a bunch of cleanup changes in the Office of Child Care rules, that we can really just focus on the content and making sure we have strong policies that promote quality, healthy, safe care.
And when are we going to start seeing those rules?
Alicia, I don't know if you have an updated timeline. One of the things that we're trying to take this opportunity to do is really have a strong equity lens in this work. And we're getting assistance nationally for this, but it is not a lift that many states have taken on. So exciting that we can figure this out, and we don't have other states you can necessarily look to for examples. So since we are really looking at how we stand up DELC with equity at the foundation, we want to make sure that that's true for licensing as well. And Alicia, would love for you to jump in.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking. I appreciate that. So when we are planning on bringing the school age rules in June for you all to review and adopt, and that will be the first step in the passage of all the rules. So the intent is that we will go forward and align center rules along with the school age rules, and then family child care will come after that. So that is a slightly different plan than what was originally presented, which was we were going to do them all simultaneously. And part of the reason for that is just capacity, to be perfectly honest. I mean, if we're doing this all in-house with national assistance, even the way that we're getting assisted nationally is like, first we'll do this set, then we'll do this set. So we are adjusting that. However, the intent is still to work off one draft and align as we go down passing the rule sets.
Okay, thank you, Alicia.
Absolutely.
Okay, questions, any other questions about DELC rulemaking? It's obviously the beginning of a long conversation. Thank you again, Kayla.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Okay, so speaking of rulemaking, staff is once again constantly trying to just, I don't know if forewarn is quite the right word, but give us some advance notice about upcoming rulemaking that the council will be asked to participate in. So David, do you want to step us through this memo, which is in our packets, or how do you want to do this? Yeah, we've got 15 minutes.
Yeah, and I think actually, I don't think I was going to be the one stepping through the memo. But, the one thing I was just going to note, I think we'd originally had the KPI rules briefing in May and June, and working on some of the feedback from the Rules Advisory Committee, and sort of trying to balance some of the ways communities are currently using funds and some of the language in the revised statute. So we just wanted to push that one back a month just to give us a little bit more time to thoughtfully work through some of those questions.
Okay, so that won't be on this agenda. So then the notifications, I guess, Alicia, we're having you again, hi, to talk about, fire safety and family care.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Chair Miller and members of the council. I'm Alicia Gardner. I'm the acting OCC director, and I have two notices. So the first one is related to the fire safety rules. So in April 2021, DCBS passed some rules requiring family childcare to have automatic residential fire sprinkling systems installed. As we know, residential sprinkler systems are expensive. They created a significant financial burden for family and childcare providers. So in November 2021, the governor's office requested that ELD, DCBS, and fire marshal develop recommendations and pass joint rules to ensure alternative methods for life safety protection. And in January 2022, ELC adopted temporary rules. So this is our notice to let you know we intend to bring these rules for permanent rulemaking in next month, May 2022. So since January, OCC and ELD has gathered feedback externally from providers as we were implementing these temporary rules, and we also held our RAC this month, April 2022, and received feedback and suggestions for mitigating unanticipated financial impacts. And so we're here. We're intending to bring these permanent rules to you in May, and I'm here to answer any questions if you all have any. I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions from council members? We assume, or I'm assuming, that you and the RAC and everyone else are coming up with some livable options that aren't going to put all family care out of business. Is that a safe assumption?
Yes, I mean, our lens from the beginning has always been like, what are the low cost, high impact rules that we can pass? So things that are, you know, they may take a little bit of time or effort, but don't actually cost anything. So it's really just kind of bringing focus to providers on how to conduct really effective drills is the main core of that.
Just as a reminder, the council adopted temporary rules to help mitigate that as well. And then I believe DCBS just had their rulemaking advisory committee yesterday on their permanent rules,
which are aligning with ours. I say
should be. Our temporary rules are aligned, so we're not anticipating major deviation for the permanent rules.
Great. Okay. Any other questions on fire safety? No. Okay, let's hear the CBR.
Okay, and so in addition, ELD intends to pass rules in May regarding modifications to the Central Background Registry rules. These rules will be proposed for temporary adoption and will allow personnel from recorded programs as well as license exempt ERDC providers to be allowed to be enrolled in the CBR as subject individuals. ELD will be enrolling providers into the CBR as their ODHS background checks expire. And this will allow additional time to enroll them prior to becoming DELC. And again, any questions? I'm here to answer.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you.
And upcoming future meetings, others. David or Remy wanting to make any comments, or just what's in our packet? Or are there any questions from council members on what is in our packet on page 36 and 37? And Angie, I know you're still on the call. I don't know if you want to make any comment about the Tribal Early Learning Hub, recognizing it's just coming up in June.
Sure. Sorry about that. I had to step away for a minute. So I missed the last, I don't know, 2 minutes. So the Tribal Early Learning Hub, yes, it is coming along well. We are working closely with Remy and Valeria on our rulemaking set. And everybody's very pleased with the outcome of the legislative session. They altered a little bit our the makeup of the TAC, Tribal Advisory Committee. And I think that's about all the update I have on that right now.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you again, Angie, for being our representative on that very important committee. Any questions on the other two? Okay, hearing none. And I apologize, I forgot to even mention the public testimony after lunch. Nobody had signed up for that. So, but I inadvertently didn't even give everybody on the call a chance to speak. So I think most people are off. Wow, Council, this was quite a meeting.
You're muted too.
Thanks. Yeah, wow, what a meeting. So I think Anne did a great job of sort of doing a synopsis and kind of an overview of, wow, a power-packed 4 hours. I thought the ODHS conversation was really informative. I appreciated the fact all 4 of our sitting agency directors were on the call. I think there's lots of messages in that fact. And as we work with ODHS and Liesl on looking at how we can play a role in helping them implement their very ambitious vision that all of us have endorsed, I think will be exciting. Certainly the hubs kept popping up for conversation, and that's something that I'll work with staff on as we figure out how to bring that conversation back to the council, probably at our June meeting, and then certainly in our retreat in October, looking at what are existing collaborations that are already operating, and is there a way to tag on to those or leverage those? Yeah, the the fellowship program that we just talked about a few minutes ago, very exciting, and we want to put that on an agenda when we've got our agency directors on the call with us, because it'll certainly be cross-agency focused. And of course, the 2 constant issues of procurement and workforce that probably aren't going to go away anytime in the near future, but certainly some things that we'll be talking about, I'm sure, and seeing if there are any incremental steps that can be taken even as we transition some of the state government roles. Yeah, Kali.
I hope that we can also, I mean, maybe it feels like both a council and a DELC question, but preschool promise, there are clear things that I think need to be adjusted in preschool promise, I think I brought this up once before, for it to work better for communities. And I'd like for us to figure out how we can make those adjustments. They seem to be fixable things, and some are policy decisions. So I just want to lift that up. It's not a huge portion, but it is for those who receive preschool promise dollars, it's very important, and it has enabled them to expand their services to children. But there are some challenges. So I would love for us as a council to spend a little time with that.
Yeah, and Kali, those are the conversations we're having with the BIPOC community engagement work group, as well as we're trying to figure out not just the funding formula, but what we need to change with implementation. So just a flag, to make sure that there's, that CI is there as well to kind of reflect, and then happy to bring that back to the council and what we're learning.
And will that be part of your EC update or deep dive, I guess, at the May meeting, Alyssa, or is that beyond May?
It could. I think we have to figure out, there's a lot going on. So I think figuring out, Sue, with you tomorrow, what the council would like to hear. Because similar to Colt, I mean, we could spend a whole council meeting getting you all up to speed on what's going on in ELD and DELC.
Right.
But happy to add that to the list.
Long list. And speaking of that, I mean, it was what Colt's staff did, I thought, was remarkable in giving us such an incredible, a comprehensive and yet overview of many programs. I was sorry that we had literally 3 minutes per student success plan. And I mean, that didn't it didn't allow us to have any conversation. And Kali, I know you were super interested in having the council exposed to that information. I think Remy can send out links to some of those plans that I think will be really helpful. But how we want to sort of revisit that, a part of the May meeting will be, doing this debrief of ODE's presentations today. So how we want to structure that beginning of our May meeting is a question, I guess, so that we can see what we were able to really focus on and what we would like to come back and have more time to talk about. So we'll try to build some of that into the May meeting. Okay, any other comments, thoughts for the good of the order? Okay, if not, thank you all very much. We so appreciate your time and commitment to this work. And have a great rest of your afternoon. The sun is shining in Portland for a minute. Look quickly.
Thanks,
Thanks, you guys.